And on this subject of finance, just in the past few minutes, we've actually had a Bloomberg M&A scoop, Capital One Financial, considering a potential acquisition of Discover Financial Services. This would be a major move to boost its credit card offerings. So that story developing as we speak. Discover has fallen about 2% this year. I just want to come back, though, to the earnings picture, because we can't not talk about NVIDIA. That's going to be surely the highlight of the earnings week. Justina, can we really use it as a bellwether of the strength of the US economy?
I think that's probably, a bit less direct. And I think one interesting thing behind kind of this immense demand for the Magnificent Seven stocks is that now there's almost this perception that it's not tethered to the US economy. It's about these secular trends. And I think that's what analysts will really be looking for this week. I mean, how is kind of demand for data centers, for generative AI, for NVIDIA's GPUs looking? But at the same time, I mean, the bar will be high. I mean, I was actually pretty surprised to see that. It's already up 47% this year. And so I think expectations are definitely lofty, to say the least. And
speaking of lofty expectations, Goldman, of course, has said that the S&P could go even higher. We've smashed through the 5,000 mark. Now they see it ending the year at 5,200. JP, are we just going to get updates like this every single month? Are more people going to agree with Goldman?
Yeah, probably. I mean, like right now, the risk appetite in the market just wants to be bullish. It just wants to be bullish against all odds, and you can have like all the good arguments about the risks out there and what could go wrong and whatever. The problem is so many people have missed the rally and are underweight in terms of risk overall, and especially in the equity space, especially in the mega cap space and in the tech space. So it's very hard to convince those people that there are risks out there and that they should be a little bit more cautious. Also, like the analysts were totally wrong last year. Not like Goldman specifically, but the analyst community as a whole. Nobody saw the rally coming. And so I feel like that everybody's a little bit more bullish this year and is a little bit more leaning out of the window. And it's just hoping that the wind is not catching them and draws them down the skyscraper.
All right, JP Barnett and Justina Lee, thank you to both of you previewing what might be a little quiet week for Eco. Still going to be quite busy on the earnings front. And coming up, Klaus Bader, Global Chief Economist at Societe Generale. He's going to be speaking to me about the global macro outlook. Stay tuned for that conversation next. This is Bloomberg.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, that we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, wow, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
Fixed Income Fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield at its new time, Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
To finish the job will take fortitude. We will need to resist the temptation to act quickly when patience is needed and be prepared to respond agilely as the economy evolves.
So San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly, as we await those Fed minutes on Wednesday. And joining me now is Klaus Bader, Global Chief Economist at Societe Generale. Klaus, I want to start with the data that we got out of the US last week. A surprise, especially on US CPI. How much of the data is noise versus signal? What do you read into it for the Fed rate path ahead?
Well, okay, let's first of all, the GDP number was, of course, stunning and way, way stronger than pretty much anybody in the market expected. We might get some slight downward revision, but they look very small. And then we had this absolutely stunning surprise on not just payrolls, but I think importantly, average hourly earnings. Those, of course, are a leading, well, they are an important influence on inflation going ahead. And then we had the CPI. Now, in the CPI, there was some noise in there. It was quite strongly driven by the housing costs, by shelter. And in the CPI, shelter has a very high weight. Now, the Federal Reserve tends to look more, not exclusively, but more at the PCE deflator, private consumption expenditure deflator. And that has a much lower weighting in housing, but a much greater weighting in medical supply, goods and services. And the PPI number at the end of the week was really a big, nasty surprise. And so while it initially looked unlikely that the PCE deflator was going to have the same buck up that we had in the CPI, now there's a lot more questions about that. Unfortunately, we have to wait until February 29th until that number comes out, which is next week.
But in your reading of all this data, when does the Fed start to cut?
Well, we've had throughout a first cut in May. And that now still looks, plausible, but I think the risks are clearly shifting that it's going to start later.
And if the Fed cuts, does the ECB follow?
They are in the same trend. I don't think that there's really a relationship about, following immediately. The euro is, of course, pretty cheap, and if the Fed moves first and is seen, well, it could actually put in a little bit of a support for the euro, which when you're fighting inflation, isn't a bad thing. But I don't think that the ECB actually looks a hell of a lot at the exchange rate. It's really inflation.
Well, speaking of messing up the choreography, I was speaking to Andy Haldane, former chief economist at the Bank of England, never backward in coming forward. Of course, he was one of the former hawks at the BOE, and yet he told me that he'd be cutting rates now if he was still on the Monetary Policy Committee. Why is he wrong?
I'm not sure that he's 100% wrong. The Bank of England, I think, just once, like most central banks, once more evident that inflation is really under control. But the UK economy is, it's uniquely weak in the context of the European economies. In the last couple of quarters, it's performed worse than the German economy. That takes some doing at the moment. And so I think that there is a case for the Bank of England to move relatively early. And let's not forget, Bank of England raised rates significantly more than the ECB, and the level of interest rates in the UK is notably 125 basis points higher than in the euro area. So I don't think that he's way off. Now, is the Bank of England likely to do it? No, probably not. Central bankers are, by their nature, cautious people. But I think that the UK, we feel very confident that the first cut is going to be in May, and arguably a little bit more confident than we are in the case of the Fed.
Well, you mentioned the flip side to his argument, which is wage inflation in the UK. What's it going to take to cool the labour market here in the UK, but also in the US?
Well, in the UK, I think the labour market is already cooling. The trouble is, at the moment, we are really in a spot of great uncertainty about the labour market data in the UK. I won't go into all the details, but there have been pretty significant problems with the return rate and the response rate in the labour market reports. Wages in the UK are decelerating. They're decelerating pretty quickly. And so I think we're on the right path here. There is one problem that is common amongst a number of economies, but not the US, which is labor productivity, as far as we measure it, has been very slow. And wage growth, of course, pretty fast. The result is that unit labor cost growth is massive. We're talking 5, 6, 7% in the UK and the euro area and Australia. And, that does have an impact on underlying price pressures. And so in an ideal world, to accelerate the economy and to reduce inflation, a bout of productivity growth would be great. But that's kind of hope. You need generally, for strong labor productivity, you need a lot of business investment in capital, investment in human capital, and you need fast demand growth. None of those is really at the moment necessarily on the cards, but these things can flip quite quickly.
And we've been talking about the China story throughout the program the past couple of hours. How much is Chinese weakness going to hold back global growth?
Well, it is holding it back, but I think that China has an interesting function here. It kind of strangles growth because, clearly the Chinese economy has some pretty significant difficulties. One is, of course, related to real estate, property. We know this. On the other hand, it also has a problem in that there really is a reassertion of the Communist Party in all aspects of life. And control also of private businesses. And so I think that one has to worry about the kind of the entrepreneurial spirit, or what Keynes called the animal spirits, in China in the private sector. Now, that suggests, and of course the demographics, that suggests that Chinese economic growth is going to be fairly low. However, we've also seen over the past year that the Chinese authorities clearly have a pain threshold of how low they let growth go. And then they stimulate, or apply some stimulus. It's been a little bit piecemeal, and so it's difficult to follow up, but there have been lots and lots of measures put into place. But they're difficult, I think, to grasp for the market participants. It's much easier, if you have what they call a big bazooka,
yes.
And then everybody knows the big bazooka. If you do lots of little things, stuff gets forgotten, but they're pretty active in managing the economy, that's clear. And the markets, as you talked about earlier.
And we await that bazooka, but alas, we only have the drip feed for now. Lars Bader of Societe Generale, thank you so much for joining me for that analysis around the world. Still ahead, all eyes really on Barclays' fourth quarter results tomorrow. We're going to discuss what to expect. This is Bloomberg.
Regional sports networks. There's a lot of, it's a business that seems to be collapsing. Leagues have sort of toyed around with, should we do something ourselves? Some teams are doing like local TV and streaming. How do you see that shaking out?
So I don't think I'm right on this, but my instincts keep telling me this is what's going to happen. Because if you remember the WWE, they launched their own network that had their own content and had their own pay-per-views. And it was kind of a smart, bold, ahead of its time move. And then they pivoted at the perfect time and they sold their content to, what was it?
Peacock, yeah.
And that was really smart too, because they were able to leverage that number as high as possible. So they always zagged where the money was and when the opportunity was. I think the opportunity for the NBA with the local teams would be to own all that themselves.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. I'm Lizzie Burden. We're just coming up to 4:20 p.m. here in London. Now, the Novartis CEO is saying that the drug maker is working on the next wave of obesity drugs. He spoke on the David Rubenstein show, peer-to-peer conversations, talking his M&A strategy, AI, and the future of weight loss drugs. Take a listen.
So we limit our use of investment bankers in general. What we try to look at is in the therapeutic areas we're in. So we're in blood cancers. We've been in blood cancers for over 20 years. Some of the most pioneering drugs in blood cancers have come from our research labs. And we say, if this is an area we're in, we have deep understanding, therefore this makes sense to actually add another medicine to that portfolio. And so we make that assessment. If it's a good strategic fit, in this case, a good financial fit, we'll make the bet. One of the things we've tried to be much more disciplined on is to try to go at the lower end of the range, so under $5 billion for acquisitions, and really ensure that they're in areas we have deep understanding. Generally, when we've gone too far away from our core, the value creation hasn't been there.
Last year, 2023, we saw an enormous increase in drugs being taken that reduce your weight, and they seem to work quite well. There are two drug companies, one in the United States and one in Europe, that seem to dominate that business. Are you going to get into that business, and why not? It seems to be extremely profitable.
It is a business we're interested in. We're working on really the next wave of medicines because I think these GLP-1 medicines that you're talking about are very well serviced by the current companies. It's a fascinating story. It goes back actually to the early 1990s. It took us almost 25 years to realize the potent effect that these types of drugs would have on obesity. But we think there's opportunity to improve on them. And we hope it's very early stage within Novartis, but can we come up with drugs that better preserve muscle, are maybe easier to take and more infrequently taken? One area of where Novartis is one of the leaders is in what are called small interfering RNA therapies. It sounds like a fancy word, but really what it allows you to do is take drugs that you normally would take every single day and make them drugs you only have to take twice a year. So in cholesterol lowering, we have a medicine that you only have to take twice a year to lower cholesterol 60%. We're working on similar medicines for hypertension, high blood pressure, other risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And the idea is, can you get to very infrequently dosed medicines? Because most people don't stay on their drugs.
In 2023, AI burst onto the scene. Everybody's now excited about AI. How is AI affecting your company, and do you think it's going to help your company?
I think AI is going to have a big impact, but I think it's going to take more time than most people expect. I think first, in productivity areas, AI has immediate applications. And I feel like in productivity, we can use AI for document management, document generation, not really sexy areas, but things that are really tractable. In our sector, most uniquely, the big question is, can you speed up or increase the efficiency of drug R&D? And there we're doing a couple of things, working on clinical trials and optimizing our clinical trials. But the big bets we've made are with Palantir, Microsoft Research Labs, Google DeepMind, and a few other partners to say, could you really discover novel drugs that maybe weren't discoverable without AI? Can you optimize drugs much more quickly? And this is all building on the pioneering work that Google DeepMind did on a technology called AlphaFold. There's a huge opportunity here, but I think we also have to acknowledge that we only understand about 5 to 10% of what is going on in the human body. So to expect AI to use that 5 to 10% to extrapolate and come up with big discoveries is going to take time.
So that was the Novartis CEO speaking on the David Rubenstein Show peer-to-peer conversations, and you can check out that full conversation. But I want to get back to banking now, because Barclays is set to release its report for the fourth quarter tomorrow, and joining us for a preview of that is Bloomberg's Tom Metcalf. Tom, what are you expecting? I suppose the focus really is how brave Venkat Krishnan can be on the strategy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a big day for Barclays, and the big question is, how far will he push it? So we know there's going to be changes. We've already heard reporting that, there's likely to be sort of cost cuts. There's likely to be more of a focus on maybe the less capital-intensive parts of the business. That's the retail and the card payments. But that's the big question. Barclays has a massive investment bank, sucks up about 50% of the capital. And how far will the executives go to sort of push that more into sort of a more manageable or more sort of pleasant level that shareholders really much prefer the recurring payments offered by a retail bank?
And then we get HSBC on Wednesday. We've had comments from CEO Noel Quinn warning of tougher times ahead. Of course, for all these banks, it's not just about the central bank pivot, but what else is on HSBC's mind looking at 2024?
Yeah, I think particularly it's their probably, as is the nature of their business, right, very exposed to China. That's going through, difficult times. And also you've obviously got the long-running commercial real estate sort of issues well documented there. And it's just how HSBC comes out of that. Obviously, if the Chinese economy recovers, you'd expect HSBC to do very well. But I think that's the point is, they've come through the interest rates cycle now. And now the big question is, how well positioned are all lenders, not just HSBC, for whatever has 2024 has around the corner.
You've got to wonder what will happen to HSBC if Trump gets back in the White House and you have even more tensions between the US and China. But I just want to talk about another story from HSBC. I see they've got a new bonus plan for the juniors, for the backroom staff, to improve transparency on compensation. Is this just a token move, Tom?
Well, it sounds interesting. I'm not quite sure how I'd feel if I was one of those junior staff, because that phrase, improves transparency on performance conversations, sounds awfully like maybe you get less sort of guaranteed pay, and then, there's much more flexibility on these discretionary side. But yeah, this is not the sort of investment bankers who, we all know have such big bonuses part of their packages. This is much more those support staff, the bank tellers and stuff. So interesting shift. But yeah, I wouldn't quite know how to feel about it yet if I was one of those staff.
Don't rub your hands is what I say. Bloomberg's Tom Metcalf, thanks for that. And of course, we look towards those results from Barclays tomorrow, HSBC on Wednesday, and Lloyds on Thursday. If we just check in on these markets as we head towards the close of the European session, of course, volumes are low because it's a US holiday for President's Day. That has read across over to European markets, but you're currently looking at the stock 600 higher 0.2%. It is a mixed picture, though, across Europe. The CAC 40 pretty unchanged. The DAX, though, lower 0.1%, and the FTSE 100 is eking out gains. It's higher 0.25%. The stock 600 has barely moved after that surge last week, 1.4%, took it to within 4 points of its January 2021 high, and we are moments away from the close. Well, coming up, Henrietta Tries is Director of Economic Policy at Policy Research, at Vida Partners. She's coming on next. This is Bloomberg.
Very, very short period of time. Every single child, every single student, everywhere on this planet will actually have access to a tutor, someone who can help educate them one-to-one.
In their pockets.
Right, and we know that one-to-one education is, in fact, the one that has the best value and the best outcome. So the idea that you can have custom to who you are, to your language, male, female, young, old, relatable, funny, serious, Shakespeare, whoever you want, can be your tutor, your teacher that you can learn from, just seems to me like such a amazing transformation across the globe.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech sector.
Spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. I'm Lizzie Burden, and stocks are finishing up the day in European trading as we head towards the 4:30 p.m. mark. So let's check in on where the day is ending. The Stock 600 is higher nearly 0.2%. The FTSE 100 higher 0.25%, but in negative territory. The CAC 40, as is the DAX in Frankfurt, lower nearly 0.2%. If we break it down by sector across the Stock 600, you've got healthcare, telecoms leading the gains. Healthcare higher 0.9%, but bottom of the basket is basic resources, lower nearly 0.5% currently. And this is because, of course, we have had those concerns about the Chinese economy, and iron ore too is lower nearly 1%. If we just zoom in on some of the stocks that have been on the move throughout the session, AstraZeneca has been one of the gainers, higher over 3% today. This is after it announced progress on its lung cancer drug. You've also got Santander enjoying a positive session today. This is on the news of its share buyback after a positive year in 2023, one of the biggest beneficiaries, of course, of those ECB hikes. And we also have Rheinmetall, the German defense company, which has had a deal struck at the Munich Security Conference to open an ammunition factory in Ukraine. It's been ramping up production since the 2022 invasion, and as we approach the 2-year anniversary of the war, it has inked this deal, making traders happy as we close the session today. Now, Ukraine aid, as I say, has been high on the agenda at the Munich Security Conference. It ended over the weekend, but NATO senior defense officials really voiced their concerns that the US may scale back support for the region. Bloomberg's Patrick Donoghue joins us now for more. Patrick, how serious is the threat of Ukraine not getting what it needs here, and Zelensky having to come to the table and make a deal he doesn't want to do?
Well, if you see what's going on in the U.S. Congress right now, the threat is very real, and this was very high on people's minds, especially this weekend at the Munich Security Conference. Ukrainian officials pushing hard to see what they can do. It all depends on what happens in the House. $60 billion has been promised from the Biden administration, but it's been months, and that's taking a toll, as Ukrainian officials have told us, on the front line. Ukraine is running low on ammunition. It's running low on weapons. It's having a very difficult time with what is now a Russian offensive. Of course, over the weekend, Avdiivka fell, which is a city in eastern Ukraine, which was under attack since the beginning of the war. And this shows what could happen as Russian forces test the Ukrainian military all across the front line, that this battle could start going the other way.
And what about the fears that if Trump got back in the White House and Russia were to attack another NATO ally, that he would just leave them hanging out to dry?
Well, those are comments that former President Trump made last week that sort of sent a shockwave through Europe. I mean, they're similar to things he said in the past. How much of that is reality is not clear. I mean, I don't think you can avoid taking. You have to take it seriously. What he says, yeah. But I mean, what it does put on the table, at least in Europe, is it focuses minds on to what extent Europe can rely on the U.S. as a partner, which is why you have such a wide-ranging discussion on what Europe can do to scale up its defense industry to put itself in a position to defend itself in a Russian attack. I mean, that might be years off, but given what the Kremlin has done in Ukraine, I mean, the war's going into its third year. Yeah, if you talk to Baltic leaders, a lot of people we talk to, especially in the NATO's eastern flank, openly talk about this. What happens if Russia attacks in the next 5, 6, 7 years?
All right, Patrick Donoghue, across all the twists and turns at the Munich Security Conference, we thank you for that analysis. Well, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was speaking out to Donald Trump about his comments on the war, and he spoke in response to an audience question at the Munich Security Conference. Take a listen.
If Mr. Trump, if he will come, I'm ready even to go with him to the front line. I think if we are in dialogue how to finish the war, we have to demonstrate people who are decision makers what does it mean, the real war, not in Instagram.
Well, joining us to talk about Trump and the upcoming US election is Henrietta Treyz, Director of Economic Policy Research at Vader Partners. Henrietta, a bold invitation from Volodymyr Zelensky there to Trump, to the front line in Ukraine. Do you reckon Trump will take it?
I sincerely doubt it. That is not something that President Trump liked to do when he was in office, and I do not think it's something that former President Trump would do now that he's out of office. He is, if nothing else, occupied by the trials and campaigning here domestically. I would find it surprising, to say the least, if he were to travel to Ukraine.
Who's your current bet to take the White House?
It's my current forecast that Biden wins the White House with a Republican Senate majority and probably a Democratic House. That is my base case with 60% odds. I do see a 20% chance that Trump wins, in which case you're implying a red wave that would get Republicans control of both the House and the Senate. And I think one thing for the Ukraine issue specifically that you'd have to be mindful of here is that there is a pretty strong hand that Democrats would have in the event Trump were to be president again, and it was Republican-controlled House and Senate, because Democrats would be in a position to hold up government funding authority as the minority party in exchange for aid to Ukraine, in exchange for aid to Israel. And they would have a very powerful upper hand, just as you're seeing the House Republicans right now being able to obstruct anything that Biden, Democrats, and Republicans in the Senate want to be able to do. They're saying no, which means that nothing will pass. Democrats, if they were in the minority, since those votes need 60 votes in the Senate, would be in a position to say, we will not keep the government open, for example, unless you provide aid to Ukraine. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but obviously we're talking about a year from now, so too long for Ukraine to rest on.
Okay, well, in the nearer term, what are the chances that either Biden or Trump drops off the ballot, other than because of an act of God?
Honestly, the act of God thing is the only place where I'm comfortable saying there's real chance. However, and I'll only say this because Zelensky brought up Instagram. On the Twitterverse, on, hyper elite media news outlets in terms of Twitter and the like, there is a foment of discord, mostly from the Democratic side right now, angling for Biden to step down, angling and saying, the polls are just not improving. He is not doing major interviews to an extreme, far fewer than Barack Obama did, far fewer than Donald Trump did, or any other president. And he really needs to get out on the campaign trail. While the White House staff, continues to sort of be in their own opinion, very secure that come March 7th with the State of the Union address, they'll be able to turn this whole ship around. And what's discomforting is that obviously we're all waiting for Super Tuesday, which is March 5th. We have no primary season to speak of here in the United States and no other third-party candidate that's going to enter the race. There were tremendous hopes for, a Nikki Haley or a Joe Manchin or someone else, literally anyone else, to enter into the race amongst market participants. Investors especially were very willing to believe that there would be a third-party candidate rushing in to save the day in the last couple of weeks here, last couple of months even. And now that's really just relegated to the inner chambers of groupthink on the Democratic punditry side. And Republicans are so enmeshed behind Trump with his immovable base that even if there was a material never Trump faction, they just can't break out of their 20-30% shell within the Republican conference to do anything about it. So a lot of the hand-wringing right now is going on in the Biden camp. Not really the Biden camp, but the Democratic camp.
So that's the political echo chamber. But if Trump does win, are investors ready for it?
I think investors are starting to position that way. I am getting a lot of questions about the proposed universal baseline tariff This is something that President Trump spoke about a lot in 2017 and 2018. If investors will remember Paul Ryan's border adjustment tax, that is when he started using the word reciprocal. And he would go out into press conferences and say, I love the idea of a reciprocal tariff. That's effectively what the universal baseline tariff is translating to. It is the only the only revenue raiser in the Trump tax plan. And the individual tax cuts that Trump passed in 2017, in order to just keep them baseline, static, where they were before, not to cut further, would cost $2.7 trillion. And if you're unwilling to change, entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, if you're unwilling to raise the corporate tax rate or raise any of the individual tax brackets, you do need to find an outside source of income. And the only one that the Trump campaign has identified is the idea of a universal baseline tariff. So investors are starting to position around that. I would say the first place to go is a combination of the EU auto manufacturers, which Trump has a personal sort of vendetta against, as his USTR discussed repeatedly during his tenure. And then obviously China, there's about $140 billion or so in items that were never tariffed under List 4B. And of course, any of the existing $370 billion worth of goods coming over from China could be tariffed at higher rates. Right now, those rates range from 7.5% to 25%. You could make that 50, 75, 150% without really batting an eye. And importantly, no votes from Congress. So the idea of a universal baseline tariff needs to be considered. It needs to be taken seriously by investors. And from my experience, we're starting to do that legwork, starting to see investors get on that bandwagon.
Okay, thanks to Henrietta Trays of Vader Partners. Trays, I should say. Thanks for joining me on Bloomberg Markets. Well, coming up, Larry Summers says there's still a chance the next Fed move could be a hike. We'll bring you part of our interview with the former Treasury Secretary next. This is Bloomberg.
My greatest advantages, I own my company 100%. No board of directors. I make a decision, we move. And I had a guy say to me, runs a big media company. This guy ran a major division, Warner Discovery. Okay. It was just Warner Media at that time. He says, you know what, when we sit in our meetings, we don't talk about Disney. We don't talk about Paramount. We don't talk about Sony. He goes, you know who we talk about? I go, who? You. I said, really? He goes, yeah, you. I go, why? He goes, we are giant battleships, and you're like a little speedboat. And if there's gold on the beach, you run rings around us, get to the beach, take the gold, and by the time we turn our battleship around, you've already taken the gold. I go, that's right. I'm always gonna be that entrepreneur. I started my company from my dining room table 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And I started by calling every television station, asking them to carry my once-a-week show. On average, they all said no 50 times, and I worked through about 50,000 no's to get 150 yeses. That guy that was at that dining room table trying to pay his phone bill is that same guy today, 30 years later. That fire is still in my belly. I still run scared, and I'm still running after that vision of building the world's biggest media company.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
The transactions.
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
And the technology.
Stop talking about the technology. Start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays.
DOJ or other authorities
priorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
Fed was going to keep rate World Cup. This is a 3
As the economic picture.
covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. Now, as we look ahead towards Wednesday's Fed minutes, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers says there's a chance the next Fed move could be a hike, not a cut. Summers spoke with Bloomberg's David Westin on Wall Street Week.
It's always a mistake to overinterpret 1 month's number, and that's especially true in January, where calculating seasonality is difficult. But I think we have to recognize the possibility of a mini paradigm shift. The soft landing paradigm with the assumption that inflation was headed down to 2 in a tranquil, healthy, real economy has certainly been called into question by these data. I think the Fed is going to have to be very careful. They were never right to be focused on March for a cut. I had been saying that seemed premature, and they and the markets have come around on that. I think that May is odds off at this point and probably should be odds off. And gosh, I think we've got to recognize what no one's talking about. There's a meaningful chance, maybe it's 15%, that the next move is going to be upwards in rates, not downwards in rates. You know, to use a metaphor, David, that I used to use on this show, the worst thing you can do when the doctor prescribes you antibiotics is finish part of the course, feel better, give up on the antibiotics because you don't like taking them, and see what happens. The disease tends to come back, and it tends to be harder to go after the second time. And interest rates elevated to contain inflation are like antibiotics. So I think the Fed has to be very careful in this environment, and I think that many people who confused what they wanted with what was real were in much too much of a hurry to declare that we were obviously in a phase of major easing with respect to monetary policy.
So Larry, let me continue your analogy to a disease, and perhaps what we have here is we're not recovering fully to 2%. On the other hand, the fever's not spiking up to 5, 6, 7% the way it was before. What happens if we have just a low-grade fever at the 3 plus level? What does that mean for the economy?
Look, you can always rush back to work when you're sick and you haven't yet recovered, and sometimes it all sort of works out. But usually, make sure you're healthy before you go back to business as usual. Gosh, Chairman Powell has said so many times, 2%, 2%, 2%. As you'll recall from our previous conversations, I didn't think it was a great idea to have had so specific and tight a target. But we've had one, and we've said it, and we've repeated it a large number of times. If we decide that 2 sort of has lost its meaning and it's not something we have to accept when there's strong political pressures to ease, if we send that signal, I wonder why anyone would believe that we're going to stick with 2.5 or 3 or whatever it is that we settle into. And then when that feeds into expectations, it'll get harder to hold the level we have. And of course, we are headed into, David, as populist election period as you or I can remember in our lifetimes. And we usually think of the Fed as a bulwark against populism, not as a reinforcer of populist pressures.
Well, perhaps a spoonful of sugar would help that medicine go down. That was, of course, the former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers with his prescription for the US economy. Still ahead, Apple faces its first ever EU fine under its alleged anti-competitive practices. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.
This will probably go down in history as one of, if not the largest financial crimes ever.
I cannot imagine a scenario where $8 billion just disappears.
Bankman-Fried has pled not guilty to multiple fraud charges.
Sam was just too important in the crypto community.
When someone says, I'm going to give $1 billion in the next 2 years, like that catches everybody's attention.
As time went on, their ideas got like weirder and weirder.
I don't think he even had almost a conception at some points that it was wrong or right. I think he just had the mentality that he has to win.
This committee will not stop until we uncover the full truth behind the collapse of FTX.
Sue, Mark.
Are you in? I'm in.
I'm in.
We're in.
Will this be the last of its kind? No. This is the nature of capitalism. Get over it.
Top names in climate finance are on Bloomberg.
I can't tell whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about climate finance.
A lot of great stuff is happening, but is it enough? No, it's not enough.
I'm biased. I'm a huge investor in both fission and fusion and hoping that it comes in time.
Transition is not going to be an event. It's a process.
But at the end of the day, it's the right thing for the planet, it's the right thing for the industry, and there is business opportunity.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. I'm Lizzie Burden. Now, Apple is going to face a European Union fine close to €500 million over the regulator's investigation into allegations that it silenced music streaming rivals like Spotify. Well, let's bring in Matt Bloxham of Bloomberg Intelligence for more. Matt, when you think about a €500 million fine, it might seem big to you or I, but if you think about a company with a $2.8 trillion market cap, it seems like a drop in the ocean, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think this fine is kind of catching up with old news and has been superseded by events. I mean, this goes back to a 2019 complaint that Spotify made to the European Union that Apple was allegedly being anti-competitive in how it's operating its platform and favouring its own music services. It basically wasn't letting people like Spotify advertise that you could subscribe to it cheaper by going to the Spotify website. And they had some other complaints in there about in-app purchasing, which kind of ultimately got dropped. Now, Apple, you might remember a few weeks ago, came out with a big, long email press release about how they were changing their business practices in Europe in response to the Digital Markets Act. And the Digital Markets Act is essentially a way that Europe is trying to crack down on these big tech companies and break these anti-competitive kind of alleged behaviours. And so I think it kind of all merges into that. I think the other thing to point out is that Spotify, quite some time ago, stopped allowing you to buy or to pay for their service through the App Store. So, there's already been quite a few commercial changes that have gone on that kind of make this irrelevant. But, I think it's posturing by the EU saying that we are a strong, policymaker and regulator of these markets.
Yeah, and Apple's defence has been that it actually helped Spotify become the top streaming service in Europe. How much of a defence is that?
I mean, it does have some credibility to it because, Spotify has a couple 100 million users, and without being accessible through the Apple platform, they wouldn't have got there. I guess the question that's, the issue that Spotify would maybe come back with is we would have been a much more profitable company if we weren't having to pay 30% of this away to Apple. We could have priced more competitively and maybe had even more subscribers than we've got today, or reinvested in new technology and services and made the product better for their customers. So, there is some merit to what Apple are saying, but I think in the bigger picture, this issue about being the platform and being a rival is a very sensitive issue, not just in Europe. It's being debated heavily in the US too. So I think, we're going to see more of this across the world in terms of how these big tech companies are policed.
Yeah, this move to kind of stop these digital platforms abusing their position as the gatekeepers to these digital products and services. All right, Matt Bloxham, thank you for that analysis. Matt Bloxham of Bloomberg Intelligence. Interesting, actually, to see Philips Securities downgrading Apple to neutral when we also have this news about the EU fine. Well, that does it for us. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. It's been a blast. We've done geopolitics, earnings, macro, so much to cover. But thanks for joining us. This is Bloomberg.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, wow, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, hosts Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters. Get the latest from and about politics' biggest power players at the end of every trading day. Balance of Power, live around the world every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's a question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
This is Bloomberg News Now.
News when you want it at the touch of a button.
Another volatile day on Wall Street. We're seeing big moves.
All eyes on Capitol Hill as Democrats and Republicans prepare.
Today's job numbers casting doubt on the Fed's next move. Inflation remains front and center. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Get it 24/7 on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Bloomberg News Now. Context changes everything.
We have already lost 50% of the world's coral cover, and we are on track to lose up to 90% in the next 30 years. Coral reef is not just an animal. They actually provide the habitat for more than 25% of the marine life on Earth, and that feeds more than 1.2 billion people. They actually are so interlinked with our daily life, whether as a source of protein, the air that we breathe, and also the coastal protections. It is the experience seeing coral disappear firsthand that got me to make the final decision to make the inhospitable seafloor, to make it hospitable again for coral reefs to recover. I'm Rico Yu. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ArcuReef. I am a scientist by training, and I am a diver as well. I grew up and spent a lot of time in the countryside of Hong Kong. I only remember going into the water and stumbled into coral reefs, and I got a lot of cuts on my feet. And that's actually the first time I learned about coral reefs, because my dad then told me not to step on them. So Hong Kong used to be a coral paradise where we have a lot of coral reefs everywhere. And what happened is that as we developed our cities, we ignored what's happening in the water. Back in 2014, I've seen a small patch of coral community disappear in Hong Kong in just 2 months. And that got me to think about what's happening and if there's anything that we can do to mitigate climate change. And that is how I started research on coral restoration and eventually found a solution that we can restore the degraded seafloor. When we first started trying to restore coral reefs, we tried all the traditional methods, but eventually, just after a year, we realized that they need something that can help them to mitigate and to face sedimentation. They need something that's biocompatible. So that comes to the final idea of creating these 3D printed reef tiles that's made from clay. So in 2022, we got an investment from our investor, ADQ, which is an Abu Dhabi-based investment holding firm. And that opened the door for us to enter our new market in the Middle East. We've been able to establish our office and also our eco-engineering facility based at Kisat. And right now we are focusing our R&D in Hong Kong, whereas we're focusing in our production in Abu Dhabi.
This is where we ultimately produce our reef tiles from start to finish. Our production goes through a roughly 7-step process. We start with clay being delivered to the facility, and then we need to mix that clay, make sure that it's the perfect consistency when we get it into our 3D printers, and our 3D printers then create this very delicate structure that make up the reef tiles that are then placed in the ocean at the end of its term.
What it does is that it turns sand into suitable substrate for coral reefs. This product in itself is also very porous, meaning that it can house the coral on top of the seafloor while also help them to mitigate the pressure from sedimentation. Over the last 2 years, we've been able to deploy just about 500 square meters over the geographies between Hong Kong and Abu Dhabi. Every time when we go back to the water, actually, the most immediate impact that you will see is small group of marine communities that lives around the habitat. You're also able to see coral recruits, that's baby coral settling on the tile because of the structural complexity and also the fact that we're using clay as a very natural material. Each reef tile will be able to house from 6 to 10 coral fragments, and our success rate is able to secure 95% survivorship after 3 years, which is at least 4 times higher than the traditional methods. We are able to integrate different technologies into our climate solutions. So for example, we use environmental DNA as an assessment tool to quantify and measure biodiversity. We also use AI to help us to recognize the fish faces in the water and to further quantify it and to capture the impact on the water.
Over time, what we want to build is coral highways and make sure that more and more corals find a place to settle and to grow. They have a value to play in the reef tourism sector that's worth over $30 billion a year, and overall it's estimated that the coral economy is worth more than $2 trillion a year.
We want people to think about and to see what's happening in the ocean. And once people see it, we know that people actually care about it, and we want to take action to protect it.
What happened was you were offered a money-losing women's basketball team, and you said, I want to be in the other sports as well. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you know, you got to be smart about this.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
Best question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
This is La Campanera. It used to be one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the most dangerous city in one of the most dangerous countries in the world, El Salvador. El Salvador has been known as the murder capital of the world. Just to get an idea, in 2015, the murder rate in El Salvador was higher than any country on earth and more than 20 times higher than the US. But right now, La Campanera feels downright safe, in large part due to a big police presence.
En apenas 3 años le hemos cumplido el sueño al país de pasar de ser el país de los países más peligrosos del mundo a ser uno de los países más seguros de la región.
Gang-related murders in El Salvador have plummeted to their lowest levels this century, and almost every person attributes it to this man. El Salvador's Nayib Bukele. Since coming to power, his tactics have led to the arrest of a higher percentage of its population than any country in the world, 75,000 people and counting.
Ya no somos los maras o las maras o los grupos delincuenciales o el país de los muertos, sino que ahora somos El Salvador, este país que ha logrado un milagro total.
Most citizens in El Salvador love Bukele, with his approval rating reaching as high as 92%, and the envy of almost every other Latin American leader, who are now starting to emulate his policies.
Creo que ya está generando mucha esperanza. Cualquier Estado tiene capacidad de derrotar al crimen organizado, que es el principal enemigo de millones de latinoamericanos.
But for some, that miracle comes with a steep cost: civil liberties.
Hay una captura masiva de pandilleros y presuntos pandilleros, y hay luego un intercambio, digamos, de esas capturas a partir de la entrega de las libertades.
Antes le teníamos a las pandillas, pero ahora le tememos a la autoridad, y eso no tendría que ser. A la autoridad se le tiene que tener respeto, no miedo.
The future of El Salvador and Latin America is at a tipping point. Does freedom have to be the price to pay for safety? In 2019, 37-year-old Nayib Bukele won El Salvador's presidential election. ending a long stretch when only two parties were able to win power.
Y sí, habrá momentos duros, habrá momentos difíciles, pero tomaremos esas decisiones con valentía. Nos toca ahora a todos tomar un poco de medicina amarga.
President Bukele didn't represent the failures and corruption of previous administrations. 3 of his predecessors from El Salvador's 2 main political parties had either been arrested or indicted.
Nosotros somos pragmáticos. Solo hacemos 2 distinciones. Quién es buen ciudadano y quién es mal ciudadano. Y el buen ciudadano debe recibir la protección del Estado y el mal ciudadano que enfrente las consecuencias de sus decisiones.
Then, one weekend changed everything.
El sábado se convirtió en el día más violento de la historia de El Salvador.
Y en marzo del año pasado tuvimos algo que nunca habíamos vivido.
Between March 24th and 27th, 2022, 87 people were murdered in El Salvador, allegedly by gangs.
Querían demostrarle al presidente Nayib Bukele que ellos tenían el control. Nosotros decidimos que ya había llegado, que ya no podíamos seguir más.
Queda aprobado el proyecto de decreto que contiene régimen de excepción.
Con ese fin de semana fatídico del 25-26 es que el presidente Nayib Bukele, reunidos con su gabinete de seguridad el 26, se toma la decisión más difícil.
Algunos le han llamado plan contraterritorial, otros le llaman plan de estado de excepción, otros le llaman simplemente plan Bukele.
Plan Bukele was a 30-day state of emergency, but since then, it's been extended 22 times and counting. It suspended a wide range of constitutional rights, from freedom of association and assembly, to privacy and communications, to being informed of the reason for arrests.
Y te lo digo yo como jefe de fracción, que estoy seguro que vamos a tener los votos de todos mis compañeros el tiempo que sea necesario y todas las veces que el presidente Nayib Bukele lo solicite. A la fecha creo que el dato oficial es alrededor de 70,000 detenidos. Tuvimos que construir la cárcel más grande de América Latina.
The new prison has a capacity of 40,000 inmates. Each cell holds 100 prisoners, all of it being showed off on Bukele's official X account, formerly Twitter. And other countries are taking notes.
Muchos países de Latinoamérica están pasando por este tipo de situaciones.
Ecuador is copying not only Bukele's approach on X, but emulating his prisons as well.
Entonces, para todos los Bukele lovers, es una cárcel igualita.
Alguna gente dice que eso es un exceso. Yo lo que creo que era exceso era la cantidad de muertos. Para mí era un exceso la cantidad de niñas violadas en El Salvador todos los días. Para mí era un exceso todos los negocios que tenían que pagar extorsión. Para mí esos eran los excesos.
And when it comes to the long-term rehabilitation plan for these prisoners, the Bukele administration does not mince words.
Un tatuaje muy común entre las pandillas es ponerse 3 puntos aquí. Uno es la cárcel, otro es el hospital y la última es la muerte. No se tatúan 4. No se tatúan la rehabilitación.
Others in El Salvador are not only critics of Bukele's harsh tactics, but victims.
Ella es mi hija, Carla Michelle Mejía, está detenida desde hace 19 meses a causa del régimen. Y es allí donde me toca que luchar para demostrar la inocencia de mi hija. Lo que les digo es que siempre el régimen ha servido para que la gente se aproveche de la gente más vulnerable.
Mejia's daughter was arrested by the state for allegedly belonging to a gang. He's been fighting to get her out since, but it's taken him months to even find her in the prison system. Mejia has not seen or spoken to his daughter since the arrest.
Usted va a los juzgados, no pueden dar la información si no va a su abogado. Va a la Procuraduría de Derechos Humanos, no es competencia de la Procuraduría dar esa información. Entonces, ¿a dónde vamos a acudir? A que nos den una información. A veces decimos, ¿estará vivo o estará muerto? Al tiempo que lleva el régimen, de tantos fallecidos que han habido, no se han pronunciado, pero ni por tan solo un fallecido del régimen.
Mejia's story isn't unique in El Salvador, and that's how nonprofits like Morvir were born. Human rights groups like Morvir and Cristasal have reported 215 deaths and thousands of abuses related to the crackdown.
Otro caso bien complicado es cuando llega el cadáver y militarizan el lugar de la vela. Entonces, allí hay algo que esconder. No quieren que se sepan qué es lo que pasó. No han sido muertes, han sido asesinatos dentro de las cárceles, o sea, asesinatos del Estado.
Y estamos muy claros de toda la batería que se viene ahora en tiempo de elecciones con el tema de encarcelamiento injusto, que muertes en los penales, sin fuente oficial, sino que de las mismas ONGs.
¿Y cuáles son entonces los números oficiales de muertes en los penales salvadoreños?
Mira, es que no lo puedes decir de esa manera. En todas las cárceles alrededor del mundo se mueren prisioneros por temas de enfermedad, por temas de... Hay un sinfín, ¿ya? Que es lo que tenemos que evitar. Que una o alguna de esa muerte sea por manos de servidores públicos. No te puedo dar un número. Darte un número sería alimentar a estos pordioseros de la sangre de muchos ciudadanos del planeta.
Pero también dar un número daría transparencia.
No, eso no es transparencia. Eso es alimentar a estos mendigos.
Por eso nace Movir, para apoyar a la gente más desprotegida. Porque los familiares de las víctimas detenidas no hallaban una solución ni una luz que las iluminara a dónde ir. No estamos defendiendo delincuentes. Vamos a defender toda aquella persona que también sepamos y demostremos de que son inocentes.
Ahora, como Crisosal, sí hemos recibido hasta 3.600 personas que han sido vulneradas en sus derechos.
Cristasal released a report in 2022 in which it denounced that inmates in El Salvador had died from torture, beatings, strangulation, or lack of medical attention during the state of exception.
El hacinamiento de los centros penitenciarios, aunado con la falta de condiciones mínimas de higiene, alimentación, acceso a medicamento, todas estas condiciones hacen que los centros penitenciarios básicamente se conviertan en unos centros de tortura sistemática de personas capturadas.
Many NGOs claim that El Salvadorans live in just as much fear today as they did before the state of emergency.
En cualquier momento puede venir una persona, sobre todo agentes de seguridad del Estado, particularmente policías, a poder realizar alguna detención sobre la base de nada más su voluntad o las llamadas anónimas. La seguridad no debería de ser una moneda de cambio a cambio de las libertades constitucionales de las y los salvadoreños.
Even though re-election is prohibited under the Salvadoran Constitution, the Supreme Court cleared the way for his re-election in 2024. Bukele has also taken a leave of absence from the presidency to campaign.
Yo le digo, es que no vamos a ganar. Vamos con la ayuda de Dios a enterrar a Arena.
What's at stake in Bukele's second term is whether safety is sustainable in El Salvador and whether it can one day exist without the state of exception.
Naturalmente, en materia de seguridad pública, tú no puedes celebrar ni quedarte de brazos cruzados por haber logrado algo que a la luz de todos era imposible.
Ahorita que hemos resuelto el tema de la violencia, nuestra meta es resolver toda la infraestructura económica de El Salvador y convertirlo en un centro vital de la región. Nuestra gran apuesta es convertir a El Salvador en el Singapur de Centroamérica.
For others, the economy is secondary on their mind, as they fear the country falling further and further into the hands of an increasingly authoritarian leader. Can Bukele's popularity last if he holds on to power for much longer?
Nuestro mayor temor es que el régimen de excepción sea utilizado con mayor frecuencia como un arma para poder acallar a las personas es muy preocupante. Que la dictadura empiece a ser más sexy, ¿no? La dictadura empieza a ser más cool y sea la justificación para poder solucionar un problema.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, well, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
the transactions,
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
and the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto.
About 22,000 deaths every single year are attributed to household air pollution, and this is just in Kenya alone. A lot of people still rely on open fires and traditional stoves to cook. Traditional stoves are not only bad for the environment, they're also really, really detrimental to health. The problem with an open fire is, picture your grandma trying to light a fire, and there's so much smoke, she's literally crying while doing it. And that's everyday life for a lot of women and girls. So we made a stove with a raised thermal efficiency. This enables families to use about 60% less fuel and can reduce household air pollution by up to 90%. My name is Charlotte Magai. I run Mukuru Clean Stoves, which is a social enterprise that manufactures improved cook stoves using recycled metal. I grew up here in Mukuru slums. It's one of the largest informal settlements in Kenya. I became an orphan pretty early, lost my parents by 10, and at 16, I became a teenage mother, had my daughter here, and when she turned 2, she suffered a very severe burn while I was cooking. We were using a traditional stove then, and that inspired me to provide a more stable stove for my community. I changed the stance of the traditional stove. Like if a child pushes it, for it to be strong enough to not fall over. We also built it in a way that would ensure that the outside part of it does not heat up. So if you touch it by accident, you do not get burned. Initially, I built the stove, like I drew it myself. Some of my neighbors who worked in metal fabrication were able to come together to help me build the first stove, which was really not the best, but we worked together over the years to refine it. That is how we still build our stoves to this day. And when there is something that needs to be changed or improved on, they're able to make that call because they're the ones who are using this stove at home. Mukuru Clean Stoves, they are made using recycled metals. We source that from local scrapyards. We call them geocalis. So that makes them cheaper for local communities. It costs us about $3.5 to make one unit, and we sell it for $10. It's about 75% cheaper than alternatives with the same thermal efficiency. We realized that for the communities that we were trying to work with, they spend about a third of their income on fuel consumption costs. And these are people $140 to $100 monthly income, so they already don't have a lot to spare. The 400,000 households combined who have been using our stoves have managed to save almost $50 million in fuel consumption costs. Every single unit is distributed by a local women business owner. It enables them to increase their household income by about $7 every single week. Starting a business from where I came from, apart from the fact that I didn't really have a business background, I also didn't really know anyone who can help. So you really have to crawl your way into spaces where nobody really knows you or understands what you're trying to do, and just fundraising, getting backers. A lot of people do not understand that some parts of the world still cook the way that we do, and they still die just because of the fact that they used a specific stove. So it's been years of trying to show a lot of people who could back you that this works. I never really thought I would fail, because even starting Mukuru itself was a success. You just have to keep working at it. By 2030, we want to reach about 10 million households across different countries in East and Western Africa. We're also developing the first in the world malaria-fighting fuel that will enable families to essentially repel mosquitoes every time they use our stoves, our fuels to cook. So in spaces like Mukuru, because of the fact that no one really hands anything to you, you have to create your own opportunities and create opportunities for others as well. And that is what we have done.
I put that vision out there that actually happened the way that I wanted it to.
You're at the end of the earth, and it's freaking cold.
I'm Cal Penn. Welcome to Getting Warmer.
Where is there money to be made in space?
Would you like to see what $20 billion buys you in the French countryside?
We have big things to come, and I can't wait to show you.
Let's suppose you're on a plane and somebody realizes who you are. They say, I have $100,000. I don't know what to do with it. Where should I invest it? Where should they put their money?
So today, it's a easier decision than it was maybe 2 years ago, because Treasury bills are 5%. So I would say, regardless of how much risk you want to take, you have to put a portion there. Then you would have to ask, really, an individual is the same, I think, as any institution. What is your time frame? Do you need to get access to this $100,000 in the next few weeks, the next few months, the next few years, not until you retire? And that will determine your investment decision.
So what do you think is the most common mistake investors make when they have 100,000, $1 million, or whatever they might have? What is the most common mistake you have observed that investors make?
I would say hubris and thinking you know more than you do, because every decision that you make has many, many layers. So as you're creating a portfolio, look at the risk as well, not just excited about the return.
And what's the best investment advice anybody's ever given to you?
Continue to learn about innovation in whatever you do, because that is where it's not exciting, that's where returns will go.
Regional sports networks. There's a lot of, it's a business that seems to be collapsing. Leagues have sort of toyed around with, should we do something ourselves? Some teams are doing like local TV and streaming. How do you see that shaking out?
So I don't think I'm right on this, but my instincts keep telling me this is what's going to happen. Because if you remember the WWE, they launched their own network that had their own content and had their own pay-per-views. And it was kind of a smart, bold, ahead of its time move. And then they pivoted at the perfect time and they sold their content to, what was it, Peacock.
Yeah.
And that was really smart too, because they were able to leverage that number as high as possible. So they always zagged where the money was and when the opportunity was. I think the opportunity for the NBA with the local teams would be to own all that themselves.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
Hello and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Embracing Instability. I'm Eric Schatzker. These are troubling times. After 75 years of relative stability, the Pax Americana, when the U.S. dominated the global economy, we live in an increasingly multipolar and fragile world. Multiple countries are battling for influence in trade, in technology, and for territory. Globalization is receding, authoritarianism and imperialism are ascending. CEOs, financial titans, and heads of state are speaking out about the dangers of geopolitics. Against this backdrop, we brought 450 leaders from across the globe back to Singapore for the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Our goal? To bridge the divide between East and West and the divide between the global North and the global South. The discussions here ranged widely, covering the testy U.S.-China relationship, the risks of widening wars in both the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and the choices and sacrifices we'll need to make to save the planet from climate change. Let's begin with a question that will determine the fate of the world, whether the U.S. and China can de-escalate. Chinese Vice President Han Zheng opened the New Economy Forum and offered his perspective on the economy, on trade, and on dialogue with the U.S.
Changes unseen in a century are unfolding at a faster pace across the world. Global economic recovery lacks momentum. Geopolitical tensions are compounded with the evolving economic landscape. Crises of food, energy, and debt are emerging. Having said that, the deepening of the new round of technological and industrial transformation has brought new opportunities for sustainable economic growth. Humankind is a community with a shared future, and a win-win cooperation is the sure way to success in doing great things that benefit all. China is ready to work with other countries to seize the development opportunities of our times, jointly address risks and challenges, and create a better future for mankind. Unilateralism and protectionism lead nowhere. The issue of security cannot be overstretched. Decoupling, severing industry and supply chains, and the so-called de-risking will all only divide the global economy into many isolated islands. We need to follow the laws of economics, support multilateralism, promote the free flow of production factors in the global market, and build industrial and supply chains that are convenient, efficient, and secure. Addressing global challenges requires cooperation and joint efforts of all countries. You all follow China-US relations closely. President Xi Jinping has stressed on many occasions that whether China and the United States can find the right way to get along bears on the future of humanity. The world is big enough for the two countries to develop themselves and prosper together.
Pragmatism is surfacing. We heard it from the Vice President today. A call for collaboration and coexistence between the world's two economic superpower and geopolitical powers as well. We in Saudi Arabia have traditionally had a very strong relationship with the U.S. going back to the creation of the third Saudi state in the 30s, and of course, that relationship has gotten from strength to strength. China is our biggest trading partner, biggest importer of Saudi exports, whether it's energy, chemicals, and other goods, and at the same time, they are our biggest exporter of industrial goods, and that relationship is set to continue to strengthen. And we hope we, like Singapore, can play a role in promoting dialogue and cooperation between these two countries.
There's a lot there that we will get into, but Minister Balakrishnan, on the state of the world right now in US-China relations.
With the US and China, I differentiate between climate and weather. Right now, I think the weather is a bit sunnier. They're preparing for the APEC meeting, and we all hope the President Xi and President Biden will have a good meeting. So the weather is improved. But I think the climate, the relationship between the United States and China is not in such a happy place.
The climate generally is getting worse between the US and China. Again, I think people would say it was better when you were around. Is there any sign of things getting better, or are they just going to get worse for a while and then maybe stabilize?
You know, part of the reason it was, somewhat more positive when I was there, and we had a very regular set of meetings, is because Hu Jintao was a Chinese leader who decided he would not stay for life. He would fulfill his term. He would follow the guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. There would be a transition, a new group of leaders, some holdovers, but, other new faces would be in power. And so there could be a constant renewing of both the Chinese government and, through that, the American relationship. Once Xi Jinping decided to stay in office for life, that creates a lot of challenges within their own system, and I think we're seeing some of that with the removal of top officials, some of the economic problems in the Chinese economy, but it also creates a kind of chilling effect in terms of relations. I mean, how do you deal with somebody who's not going to be held accountable? Their system of accountability was certainly different from ours, but it existed, and now it doesn't. And so part of what I hope will come out of this meeting is an attitude by President Xi that, he wants to get back to some kind of regular order, that he sees it in China's interest to really dig in with President Biden, develop a platform for discussions, for problem solving, look for ways to cooperate on whether it's, climate change or other matters that may be of mutual interest to us, really sending that signal. I think he will find a receptive partner with President Biden if that's available.
Coming up, Ken Griffin, the founder and CEO of Citadel. This is Bloomberg.
In a very, very short period of time. Every single child, every single student, everywhere on this planet will actually have access to a tutor, someone who can help educate them one-to-one.
In their pockets.
Right, and we know that one-to-one education is, in fact, the one that has the best value and the best outcome. So the idea that you can have custom to who you are, to your language, male, female, young, old, relatable, funny, serious, Shakespeare, whoever you want, can be your tutor, your teacher that you can learn from, just seems to me like such a amazing transformation across the globe.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal.
to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Welcome back to Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Embracing Instability. I'm Eric Schatzker. On day 2 of the forum, I spoke with Citadel founder and CEO Ken Griffin. As you're about to see, Ken is full of conviction on everything from interest rates and inflation to the criminal prosecutions of former President Donald Trump.
Regretfully, the peace dividend is clearly at the end of the road. No matter what one may dream to be reality, reality is there's 2 wars in the world right here, right now, one of which is in Europe. So there's no doubt that the NATO countries are going to have to increase defense budgets over the years ahead. That's going to come at a point in time where governments around the world are already struggling with the sizes of their deficits. And then when it comes to globalization, I mean, we're in Singapore. We are at one of the global nexus in the world of trade, of finance. Many of us in this room have been tremendous beneficiaries of globalization. And it hasn't been great for everybody, to be clear. But for the world as a whole, it's pulled 1 billion people out of poverty. But now we're talking about deglobalization. We're talking about re-architecting supply chains. And some of this is rooted in the behavior that we saw in the pandemic. We saw countries hoarding personal safety equipment. We saw the tension around the distribution of vaccines around the world. Countries are much more sensitive to what do we want to have created domestically so that we're not reliant upon global trade. And then take that into the general geopolitical trends right here, right now. The war in the Ukraine has resulted in Europe losing access to natural gas from Russia for all intents and purposes. Europe struggling to deal with how does it maintain its economy having lost its cheap source of energy. So there's many trends at play right now that are pushing us towards deglobalization. And with that is almost certainly a trend towards higher baseline inflation.
Over what period?
It could be for decades.
And the implications of higher inflation might be obvious to some, but I think we'd all like to hear it from Ken Griffin.
Well, it depends on where this baseline effect lands. If we're looking at a 2 or 3% baseline effect, in some sense, the central bank will have a much easier job in the United States. The struggle over the last 20 years has actually been to hit a 2% target. And there's a variety of reasons that you want a low level of background inflation. It helps to lubricate the wheels of commerce. And that number the Fed has committed to as being 2%, they're going to fight pretty hard to keep that as the target for a litany of good reasons. But it also means that we're likely to see higher real rates, and we're likely to see higher nominal rates, and that will have a real implication on the cost of funding our enormous deficit. The U.S. has $33 trillion of debt outstanding. We didn't plan for an era with higher nominal and higher real rates when we went on the spending spree that created a $33 trillion deficit.
I would say inflation is still, to me, the single biggest risk, certainly to economic growth, to purchasing power, to the deployment of capital. And then if you think about how perverse inflation is for those who are less well off, that has a very negative effect on prosperity, lifting people up out of poverty, or even those in the lower middle class that are trying to rise beyond the lower middle class. It's just very perverse for that category, which is in essence what all of us are trying to do in terms of driving economic growth to lift more people into the system. So I think inflation is far and away the biggest concern. And I think the geopolitics that are now overlaid in a much more profound way, in many ways you could say that the peace dividend we've had for the better part of 25 or 30 years is kind of over. And we're entering, unfortunately, perhaps a new era with more geopolitical tension, more war, more challenge that I think is going to make it even more complicated to create more economic growth.
Jenny, inflation and that journey to 2% for the Fed, I mean, the markets were quick to conclude that the Fed was done and then change its mind. Was the Fed right in standing pat?
I do think the Fed was right to stand pat. I think that, though, the journey to 2% is going to be a lot more challenging. And I would just add on, so like, John, really leave a couple things for the rest of us to talk about on the rest, okay?
He says he's paid to worry about everything.
But so completely agree with all the points that John made. I would just say the other challenge that I don't think gets enough, and you're starting to hear about it more, is, even if the Fed is able to slow the economy such that it gets inflation lower, there is this issue of just supply and demand for U.S. treasuries and U.S. debt. I mean, the reality is the U.S. has gone from $7 trillion or $9 trillion in 2007, $31 trillion. We're going to add $2 trillion more. You have to have buyers. Now, there'll be buyers. The question is, at what price will there be buyers? And then, one, how much does that crowd out other investment opportunities? And two, does that mean higher for longer, which I tend to feel like that is an issue. So I think along with the inflation, even if the Fed does their job in trying to slow it down, they don't control U.S. spending, and that debt, I think, is adding a challenge.
You ask risk, the other side of risk is return. So perhaps, if you sort of wear more of that cap, Jenny talked about, treasury bond or cash yielding more. That's a positive thing for investors. In fact, I would say, look at U.S. tips, right? U.S. 10-year tips is yielding a real yield of 2.5%. We haven't seen that for a long time. It was negative. That means you actually get inflation-protected return guaranteed, right? Because I believe the U.S. government is rock solid. For 10 years, you clip, 2.5% above inflation. That's very attractive, I would say, and that's actually great competition for a lot of other asset classes, right? If you were to take additional risk, you have to expect a return higher than that level of 2.5 real. So that's one way to look at it. Generally, asset use going higher should be good for long-term return.
A risky environment and certain environment is a great environment for healthcare. So you should be thriving.
I think that we're at a moment where we're kind of being increasingly suffering from a series of pandemics. I come from a world where we worked on a pandemic at Moderna, and we think that a pandemic means a disease that afflicts the planet. But actually, literally, a pandemic means anything that afflicts all people on the world, essentially in a negative way. And so think about what's happened. You have a pandemic, a health pandemic, that led to a financial pandemic, a supply chain pandemic, a geopolitical pandemic, a war pandemic, a misinformation pandemic, and then you have the climate pandemic waiting to get its chance to really have a big impact. And so what has that done to our general notion of economic equilibrium? Well, it's made it laughable, I think. And in nature, these things happen. It's called punctuated equilibrium. And I think we should really start thinking about, and I heard a little bit this morning, when will it go back? The people who wanted things to go back are the incumbents. Insurgents wanted to go forward because in the back, they really don't have a role to play because they're dominated. And so I think what you're going to see in this environment is the appearance of a different and new equilibrium state. It's very scary because obviously investors value predictable, profitable growth. There is no predictable, there's hardly any profitable, and there's hardly any growth.
I personally think that I'm more in the camp of high for longer than higher for longer. But I don't see how we can bring back inflation at target. Everybody focuses very much on the big drop, but the truth of the matter is that inflation is well above target rates across the globe, and is much stickier than we think. So I don't see how you can bring back inflation without creating an economic downturn. We start to see it now, clearly in Europe, and most possibly also in the US soon.
So if you have interest rates high for longer, and there's an economic downturn, what breaks? Is it companies defaulting? Is it commercial real estate? Or are there other pockets in the market that you worry about?
Look, I would say that companies, the vast majority of the companies are well placed in terms of capital position. I'm not so concerned at this stage about the private sector. There are, and if you want to look at major events, right, black swan events or things that can really go wrong, history tells us that they usually come from government or real estate. So I think that while we look at the private sector, I think that the reality is that the most fragile part of the equation, if I look at the real estate, commercial real estate markets across the world, the post-COVID positive momentum was very short. So, and now the reality is that we see that COVID has changed the way people work, people use offices, and we see as we speak that that one has to be watched carefully.
Coming up, John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
the transactions,
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
and the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays. Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern every weekday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
DOJ or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
It was going to keep Green World Cup. This is a three.
As the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley.
Welcome back to Singapore and Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Embracing Instability. I'm Eric Schatzker. Former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry delivered a riveting close to this year's forum, setting priorities and expectations for the important work that needs to be done at COP28 in Dubai.
You ask, what is it that's in the way? The imperative of status quo, the way money works, the numbers of people who have pressured some of the oil and gas companies because they weren't doing as well as the ones that weren't doing stuff on the climate. Look at the pressure, a bunch of asset owners and managers in New York and elsewhere in the world have been under to make more money. So put it down to greed, G-R-E-E-D, greed. People do not want to transition. People are waiting. People say, oh, it's in the future. It's not in the future.
It's the biggest existential crisis facing us now.
And
but
it
getting
is
that
being
message,
delayed by personal and by unwillingness of people to grab the bull by the horns and do what you need to do here.
in that context, then, what's a successful COP28 in your mind?
Well, I think doing the things that are mandatory, obviously. We have a mandatory report on adaptation. I think we will increase the level of funding for adaptation, but we will balance it with mitigation. We will have major step-ups, I think, in mitigation effort, and they will come, some of them, from these sidebar things, like the shipping challenge and the agriculture mission and the First Movers Coalition and so forth. But those aren't substitutes for the fundamental need to have NDCs of countries that actually drive their country's policy to keeping 1.5 degrees alive.
The science is so clear. We're 1,200 islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Most of our islands are just about 1 meter above sea level, and we are observing sea level rise of 3 to 4 millimeters per year. We are seeing most of our islands are eroding at an alarming rate. Most of our islands are getting flooded during the rainy season, more than we used to see. And the biggest impact that I have seen, even in my own life, is the slow death of our coral reefs, which is the source of income for us, which is the source of protection for us as well. So impacts of climate change is an everyday reality for us.
My view is for this climate transition to happen, the big thing we need is solutions at an affordable price. The US is playing a big role, I think, at the moment. Out of the money being invested, a lot of it is going to electric vehicles. So they're giving us $7,500 credit per vehicle, and the estimate is that passenger vehicles are going to go up by 13 times by 2030. This is IEA versus 3 times without the IRA. That's helping. A big one is on hydrogen. We really need a form of firming for renewable energy, and the estimate is there'll be 5.5 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030, but we need to get that price down to, say, $2 a kilogram, and the incentives in the US will probably crack the code for the world, and as Mark says, those technologies can get rolled out.
Who is going to accelerate, pull through a combination of industrial policy, our topic, but corporate action, corporate leaders, and there's a series of initiatives around that, but they're not yet getting the traction they need at scale. And then, you know, GFANs, the members, whether it's Macquarie, Brookfield, HSBC, whoever, you know, provides the financing against that really accelerates. And that's what we need to do, and that's part of the opportunity of getting everyone around the table at COP. And I think that's, so we should look for something and push for something on that front.
But you're hopeful about COP? That we get something concrete?
I think all the right people are there, and the right issues have been put on the table. So, yes, I mean, in that regard, we should, you never take things for granted, but we should force the issue.
That's all from Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Embracing Instability. You can find the complete interviews and more content from the forum at Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Eric Schatzker. This is Bloomberg.
Names in climate finance are on Bloomberg.
I can't tell whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about climate finance.
A lot of great stuff is happening, but is it enough? No, it's not enough.
I'm biased. I'm a huge investor in both fission and fusion, and hoping that it comes in time.
Transition is not going to be an event. It's a process.
But at the end of the day, it's the right thing for the planet, it's the right thing for the industry, and there is business opportunity.
I think this will probably go down in history as one of, if not the largest financial crimes ever.
I cannot imagine a scenario where $8 billion just disappears.
Bankman-Fried has pled not guilty to multiple fraud charges.
Sam was just too important in the crypto community.
When someone says, I'm going to give $1 billion in the next 2 years, like that catches everybody's attention.
As time went on, their ideas got like weirder and weirder.
I don't think he even had almost a conception at some points that it was wrong or right. I think he just had the mentality that he has to win.
This committee will not stop until we uncover the full truth behind the collapse of FTX.
Sue, Mark.
Are you in? I'm in.
I'm in.
We're in.
Will this be the last of its kind? No. This is the nature of capitalism. Get over it.
From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, hosts Joe Matthew and Keely Lyons deliver news, insight, and analysis live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters. Get the latest from and about politics' biggest power players at the end of every trading day. Balance of Power, live around the world every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
If I can have everybody answer the same question, what do you come to work to do every day? And the answer to that is because we're the custodians and we're responsible for the savings and the pensions of real people like my mum and dad and your mum and dad, then we do a better job every day.
It's the world's largest listed hedge fund manager. And after 240 years in existence, Man Group has a woman in charge for the very first time. Robin Grew was promoted from president to chief executive last September, the high point of a 15-year career at the firm. The former barrister entered the world of finance 3 decades ago and never left.
The speed of change, the impact, the global nature, the challenge of it just never stopped getting more and more infectious for me.
In this episode of Leaders with Lacroix, I speak to Robin Grew about diversity, purpose, and what the future holds in an ever-changing world. Robin Grew, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders. The world is a bit strange. There are so many polycrises, or whatever you want to call it. It's just difficult to get a handle of what comes next.
Yes, that would be the shortest answer I could ever give. Yes, it is difficult. I think that if this year has taught us anything, it's that prediction is not our strongest suit, perhaps. And that isn't just in relation to markets, it's in relation to these big geopolitical events that we are still living with.
But it's quite incredible to think that we're in a better place than we thought. I feel like every 6 months, there's like the doom and gloom crew saying, this is it, interest rates have gone too much, we need to reevaluate what happens next. And yet, the economy holds.
I think that's right. I think when we talk about it and we have this conversation about higher for longer, which I still say out loud, and then cross my fingers in some ways that maybe I'm going to be entirely wrong, but higher for longer. I think where the nuance is in that message is that what we're unlikely to see is 0%. We're probably unlikely to see 2%. We may see some 50 basis points adjustments, for sure. But I think what we have been signalled clearly from central banks is that they're not frightened of using policy to control inflation or to try and respond to inflation. And I think that's the messaging we should all kind of get used to. Last 10 years, 0% free money. Next 10 years, higher for longer, with that slight nuance in the way that I described.
And I imagine that 2024 could be difficult because of volatility and
dispersion.
And
yes.
So it makes it harder actually to manage money.
I think it does. And I think the denomination effect that we saw because of the kind of the hiccups in the system with the banking crisis or with LDI, that also put a premium back into liquidity. So what's your duration risk? What's your liquidity risk? How do you manage through these different economic cycles? And are you prepared or are you ready for hedging, which means that, let's remember what that means. It means that at times you're going to do well and at times you're not going to do well with the entirety of your portfolio. And that's okay, that actually managing your portfolio for these different changing economic cycles or behaviors is what you're supposed to be doing.
Does it change how you lead Man Group?
It changes because of the way that we position the organization. We are an organization that is diverse. Our capabilities are diverse. We have different engines doing different things, be it in the quant side or on that fundamental discretionary side. We have products that are in the macro space, products that are in equities. We are long only, we are long short. But what we are seeing is our clients are interested in more customized solutions, in solutions that actually answer the problem they've got or the challenge they have, rather than here's a product, buy that or nothing else. So it changes in the way that you deliver an organization. It changes in the fact that the value you're driving towards is not just about here's a product, but it's here's a solution.
So what does it mean in how you're focusing your energy on in 2024? I know you want to be in the private credit space,
yep.
But I guess hiring is also something that you need to think of carefully.
We don't make widgets. What we have are highly talented individuals who are focused on being the very best they can be in the workplace and delivering what they do. And that can be alpha in our engines, or it can be in our operations and middle office department, or it can be in our legal department. It's about a war on talent. So hiring the very best people, retaining, keeping those people, giving them opportunity, giving them a space where they can be the very best they can be is incredibly important. So it's tech, it's talent, it's vision. It's about knowing that when people come to work every day, every single person at Man Group adds value and is valued. That's important. It's that moment. If I can have everybody answer the same question, what do you come to work to do every day? And the answer to that is because we're the custodians and we're responsible for the savings and the pensions of real people like my mum and dad and your mum and dad, then we do a better job every day.
So how do you hire? Again, there's a war on talent, or
yep.
there's a battle to get the very best.
Yep.
So what do they want?
They want, so depends. I think that's the one size doesn't fit all thing. Who doesn't want to be around really smart people? Number one. Who doesn't want to be around a place which values your input? Who doesn't want to be in a place that doesn't seek to be better today than it was yesterday and better tomorrow than it is today? Who doesn't want to be around a place which is actually interested in you as a person and interested in being capable of making you better? So where do we go? We go broad, we go wide, we look for difference, we look for energy and excitement, that person who's able to get energized.
You don't always hear that from a big finance chief executive.
Okay, I'm not.
Is there a
apologizing.
perception problem for finance?
I think finance hasn't done as good a job as we might in explaining the value we bring to society more generally. I don't cure cancer. That's not what I do. I wish I could. I mean, I wish I was that smart and capable to do that. But what we do is protect and enrich the savings and the pensions of people who've worked incredibly hard all of their lives and diligently put their money aside in their 401k or wherever it may be. And we're entrusted with that, and we can give them, if we do our job well, financial security. We can provide something that enables legacy investing. It enables access to healthcare, to education, to a roof over your head, to pay the bills, to all of those things. That's a pretty important thing to do.
I mean, it's amazing. You seem to be filled with a big sense of purpose, which you don't often get from hedge fund managers.
I have a big sense of purpose. I run a firm that has a big sense of purpose, and I think that energy is something we should put to work. When I sit down with big allocators and we talk about what it is we're both trying to do, it's the same. I think the day we forget that, and the day that I think about our numbers in the sort of the institutional size numbers that we all talk about, we lose a bit of that sense of what we're here to do properly.
Coming up, Robin Grew on adapting to change in an uncertain future.
I'm not good at predicting what the next year or the next 5 years is going to be. What we need to do is be flexible, is to understand and be dynamic, to think about the impact of markets and changes.
This is Bloomberg News Now.
News when you want it at the touch of a button.
Another volatile day on Wall Street. We're seeing big moves.
All eyes on Capitol Hill as Democrats and Republicans prepare.
Today's job numbers casting doubt on the Fed's next move. Inflation remains front and center. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Get it 24/7 on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Bloomberg News Now. Context changes everything.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech sector.
Spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
From renewed geopolitical risks to climate change, a new era for interest rates, and a different working reality, the world of finance is also adapting to change. I continue the conversation with Man Group Chief Executive, Robin Grew.
Do you worry about what the future economic, footprint looks like for the world?
So our job is to say, how do we think about what could happen? How do you stress your portfolio? How do you think about what your outcomes are today? People drawing their pensions today versus drawing their pensions 50 years from now. Man Group is 240 years old. We match the duration rather neatly of some of our clients who aren't thinking about just returns for a year from now, but are trying to think about what they're planning for 30 years from now. We're not good at predicting. I'm not good at predicting what the next year or the next 5 years is going to be. What we need to do is be flexible, is to understand and be dynamic, to think about the impact of markets and changes.
Are you more worried about geopolitics or about market functioning?
Well, I think the fact that we've now changed geopolitics to geoeconomics is something of an impact point. So as we think about what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and the impact on our fossil fuel pricing, or you think about the worries and concerns around supply chains post-COVID and the fact that these buffers, when you think about corporate real estate and the refinancing that is inevitable. I mean, it's not a 30-year mortgage. These are things coming up for refinance within the next 3, 4, 5 years. That's a lot of money being put to work. And we're in an environment where we look out onto the city, office buildings are in a different place and have a different level of occupancy than we've seen before. So these are big changes. And geoeconomics, I think, and things that we have to take into consideration.
What do you worry about the most? Do you have like a ranking, or is it almost one and the same? It's just this huge transformation and change.
I think it is a transformation and change. I think that we're going to see credit markets playing a role. I don't think that's a short-term thing. I think that's a real-term thing. I think if you see lending tightening, you're going to see still a need for financing out there. But it isn't that all things are created equal. I'm a big proponent of active management. I am a big proponent of credit. But not every active manager or not every credit expert is going to be able to deliver in these environments. There is expertise and skill needed. How do I think about prioritization? I think about priorities in terms of capabilities. I think about being as skilled as we can be in data, in analytics, in tech, in credit, in multiple asset classes, and then being able to pivot those. I think that's where I think about things. But do I think about that's the number one thing I'm focusing on? I don't have the luxury of that. I think we have to think about all of these things.
I mean, are you looking at acquisitions to be in certain spaces?
We have always said that we will grow the firm organically, and we will always look for acquisitions to increase our capability on content for clients. I think what's interesting, as we completed our acquisition with a private credit manager in the US in the middle markets, I think what's interesting is that the multiples look more interesting. I think we've been talking about consolidation, right? We have been talking about consolidation since the GFC. Since the GFC. I mean, this is one of those points I'm going to perhaps want to laugh about in a few years' time from now. But I actually think as we look at the barriers to entry in this space, if we look about the cost of running our businesses, if we think about the scale that we need to operate at, I think, and the multiples that we're starting to see coming down, I think this could be an interesting time for consolidation.
But why has it been a long time coming? Is it regulation, or there was just no appetite, or it just wasn't ripe?
I think when cash is free, it softens that. I think the moment where people need to deploy at scale in liquid markets has been something that's softened. If you look at the trend has been in passive, it's been in private equity. If you think about the number of assets that no longer sit in the public domain, that's been our themes over the last 10 years. I think when private equity doesn't have quite as much cash, when that raising is harder, when lending is harder, these opportunities for niche spaces and expertise to come about, and they want scale. They need to be able to operate at scale, and having an organization that can deliver the amount of scale we've put in play, the bit that perhaps is less sexy and exciting, but that infrastructure, the ability to take businesses and grow them, that's what we do.
What do you think of the City of London? Will it lose a bit of a luster? There's a lot it can offer. Like, where do you see it in 5 years?
You're looking at a UK, well, you're talking to a UK-listed CEO, so I could not be more interested in UK PLC. I think we have held such an extraordinary position in financial markets and generally, so anything we can do to keep that shine, I think is important. But competition is high. And we shouldn't, in the way that we shouldn't in our firms, sit on our hands and think that all of our history is going to count for long if we don't keep running. So I'm a great believer that we drive and continue to drive UK PLC. There is such a lot of innovation and creativity and growth here. There's such a lot of expertise that sits in these small shores. So anything we can do to keep that alive and keep it at its top game, I'm all for. But we operate as a global organisation, and I'm going to go where there is strong capability to invest, where the markets are deeper, where the clients need us to be, and where we can find opportunity. And I'm going to continue to look for that. But I'm a UK-listed CEO who can't help but want this to be great too.
Up next, Robin Grew on being a female leader in an industry traditionally dominated by men.
I am hopeful that we're going to see a better reflection of difference at the top of every organisation, be it financial services or broader than that.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, that we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, wow, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
You were offered a money-losing women's basketball team, and you said, I want to be in the other sports as well. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you know, you got to be smart about this.
Women make up less than a quarter of employees at the thousands of hedge funds and other alternative investment firms globally. They're even more of a minority in senior positions. So when Man Group appointed an all-female leadership team last year, it marked a massive shift for the company and a milestone for the industry. I continue the conversation with Robin Grew.
Robin, 240 years old.
Yes.
Man Group is, and you're
Not
the first female. You're the first female
yes.
chief executive of an institution that's at 240 years old.
Yes.
Is it, you know, should it have been earlier? Like, are you optimistic about the future for females in finance?
I am hopeful that we're going to see a better reflection of difference at the top of every organisation, be it financial services or broader than that. Has it been a long time coming? I can't help but say, listen, it would be terrific. It would be good to see more female CEOs before me. I hope we're going to see a lot after me. But difference is important, and I think anything that enables us to put the most talented people at the top of organisations and to lead those organisations with enthusiasm and capability is what we're after. So I'm hopeful that I'm knocking down some doors, barriers, ceilings.
I mean, the first time someone meets you, it's like the infectious energy, right, that people notice.
Yes.
Is that how you lead?
Yes. it was one of those things. I've been accused of being many things over my time, but that sort of slight Duracell bunny, ever ready to put those battery things, just keep on going. I'm a bit that. I have an enthusiasm for what we do and a passion for what we do. It is sometimes like I'm a big boom in the room, but it's something that I think is incredibly important. You don't do this job 98%. You do this job if you can. This is where my mathematicians hate me when I say anything larger than 100%, but it's 100% plus.
Were you always like that, or is
Yes.
it something that you've learned? It's just natural.
Yes, and to some extent, it's what's forged my career. That willingness and that excitement to learn and to be part of fixing things, doing things better, has been somewhat of a hallmark. I have a ridiculous enjoyment for learning and doing things. You know, I walk into any organisation or any of our offices, and in the short journey, thankfully, in London that you have from the 0 to the 5th floor, if there's somebody in the elevator with me, I'm asking 1,000 questions. You know, they kind of wait to get out of the door by the end of it in some ways. But it's that interest in what's going on and what's happening. And it's an interest in people. I fundamentally am driven by being interested in the people I work with and in the people who we're here to work for.
So you started as a criminal barrister?
I did.
And then went into finance 3 decades ago?
Yeah, something like that.
What made you switch?
The thing was this. I loved being an advocate, and perhaps I think I'm still an advocate in many ways. So what happened was I was in the criminal and the civil bar, and I thought, I'll go do this commerce thing, I thought to myself, and I will go back and become a commercial barrister. And it sucked me in, and I never went back. The speed of change, the impact, the global nature, the challenge of it just never stopped getting more and more infectious for me. And so that legal training, has it been useful? Yes. Has the advocacy thing been perhaps more useful? Probably. But it's been just the best journey.
Do you have bad days? And if you do, who do you call? Do you have a mentor?
Yes, who do you call? Ghostbusters. If I have a bad day, I've always been a half-full kind of person. Yeah. Every belief I have is that you make the best out of those tough days. Of course there are tough days. Of course there are days when you're put a challenge in front of you where performance isn't great or where I feel like we could have done a better job. Those are moments where you've got to move forward. You've got to take the next step forward. And that's what I do. I think it's resilience. I think it is part and parcel of perhaps my makeup is to be resilient. Who do I turn to? I turn to friends and family, and I take a break. I take a breather, although normally not very long a breather because I just get too excited by other things. But I fill my life. I fill my life with the things that are really positive around me. I have a great family around me. I have an extraordinary wife and a son and my parents and friends, and I am enriched by that. And so that enables me to take the next step.
Do you think there's a difference being a leader in 2024 to what it was like in even 2010? You know, does leadership or chief executive jobs need to come with more of a sense of purpose and kind of morally leading?
I think that I don't know a different way of doing it than the way I do it, and that's with a sense of purpose for sure. When you speak and you are in charge of an organisation, I think it is incumbent upon leaders to be enthused and to be passionate and be engaged. I think when times are tough, when things are tricky in the world, I think it's important that you know that and that you acknowledge that in your organisations. And we have had some tough times in the world, beyond markets, in the world, for people to live their lives. We run global organisations with people who come from places that are now in war zones or that are too close to borders where there are war zones, where the challenges have been very real post-COVID, or where the issues are being felt materially in politics. And not to acknowledge that, I think, feels inauthentic.
When you're in charge of a big organization, it's tough being close to your employees.
Yes.
How do you do that?
It's about communication. It's about being available and transparent.
Yeah.
It's about setting your stall out. Who are we? What are we? What are we here to do? And how are we going to do that? How do we do that the best we can? My view is you do it by creating extraordinary and exceptional teams that have a focus and that understand the humanity of that, and that that's important. To do that, you need different people. To do that, you need to bridge it, because different people come with different backgrounds and different flavors of their experience of life. It isn't an easy thing to do. It's just a thing we should do.
It's tough, right? Also, I guess, employing people that will say no to you.
Yes.
How much do you think of that? Of actually being surrounded by people that say, no, this is not a great idea.
I think it's critical. If I'm going to have people around me, their excellence needs to be something I hear. It's less likely, I mean, my executive team might get cross at me at saying this, but it's really not the most likely pool of people. My executive committee is less likely the pool of people from which the next brilliant idea is going to sprout and germinate. It's going to be levels and other people within the firm. We need to hear that, and it's important that I am seen as capable of listening and changing my position. There are times when I am going to be less willing to change my position, but having somebody who's going to come from any part of your organization to say, hey, I feel this way about this issue, and I don't think I'm being heard, is important.
Where's Robin Grew in 5 years?
Still Duracell bunnying. I'm the best answer to every battery life, but perhaps on a renewable chargeable basis. So where am I? I hope still leading Man Group. I hope looking back on the last 5 years and thinking how I could do it even better. I hope driving things with the same passion and enthusiasm, and I hope with the same brilliant set of people around me.
Robin Grew, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
One of my greatest advantages, I own my company 100%. No board of directors. I make a decision, we move. And I had a guy say to me, runs a big media company. This guy ran a major division, Warner Discovery. Okay. It was just Warner Media at that time. He says, you know what, when we sit in our meetings, we don't talk about Disney. We don't talk about Paramount. We don't talk about Sony. He goes, you know who we talk about? I go, who? You. I said, really? He goes, yeah, you. I go, why? He goes, we are giant battleships, and you're like a little speedboat. And if there's gold on the beach, you run rings around us, get to the beach, take the gold, and by the time we turn our battleship around, you've already taken the gold. I go, that's right. I'm always gonna be that entrepreneur. I started my company from my dining room table 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And I started by calling every television station, asking them to carry my once-a-week show. On average, they all said no 50 times, and I worked through about 50,000 no's to get 150 yeses. That guy that was at that dining room table trying to pay his phone bill is that same guy today, 30 years later. That fire is still in my belly. I still run scared, and I'm still running after that vision of building the world's biggest media company.
Regional sports networks. There's a lot of, it's a business that seems to be collapsing. Leagues have sort of toyed around with, should we do something ourselves? Some teams are doing like local TV and streaming. How do you see that shaking out?
So I don't think I'm right on this, but my instincts keep telling me this is what's going to happen. Because if you remember the WWE, they launched their own network that had their own content and had their own pay-per-views. And it was kind of a smart, bold, ahead of its time move. And then they pivoted at the perfect time and they sold their content to, what was it, Peacock?
Yeah.
And that was really smart too, because they were able to leverage that number as high as possible. So they always zagged where the money was and when the opportunity was. I think the opportunity for the NBA with the local teams would be to own all that themselves.
Well, Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin. The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
the transactions,
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
and the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto.
DOJ or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges.
What's next?
Was going to keep rating World Cup. This is a three.
As the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
This is Bloomberg.
I'm Shonali Bassick, and this is the next big risk. It's the job of a financial executive to calculate the unknowns. Geopolitical tensions are rising across the globe as conflict engulfs countries in the Middle East and Europe, and concern builds around Taiwan and China. Investors are also uncertain about the state of the economy and a divisive presidential election in the U.S. just months away. The next decade could build on problems that are brewing today. To gauge those issues, we spoke to prominent leaders on Wall Street with an eye around the corner. Ray McGuire, the president of investment bank Lazard, believes the failure to invest wisely in U.S. education is putting the country at a competitive disadvantage and creating risks to the American dream. TCW's Chief Executive Officer, Katie Koch, sees an aging population creating challenges for the retirement system. And billionaire Wes Edens, a co-founder of Fortress Investment Group, who now runs New Fortress Energy and also owns stakes in prominent sports clubs around the world, he believes we are living in a perilous time, a world rife with geopolitical risks that markets have not begun to price in. Let's begin with Ray McGuire. We discussed how inequality in the United States education system is creating a permanent underclass.
The singular issue that will determine how our country fares, both locally and how we fare globally, is education. It's at the core of this. It's at the core of whether or not we have the opportunity to realize the American dream. It's also at the core of whether or not America can remain in the lead on the frontier of innovation and competitiveness.
So what's wrong with our educational system today?
The question is, what's right with it? And I can't tell you that I find a lot. The returns that we're generating, if I put it in the context of returns, are unremarkable at best. At the national level, we spend $800+ billion, which it sound a lot. That's 3 to 4 to 5% of GDP, or of the budget rather, and we spend maybe 19, 20% of this on defense. Both are obviously important, but you can see the delta. Where we rank competitively in education, we have dropped, notwithstanding the amount of dollars that we've spent. We've dropped on a global stage. It used to be that we were in a premier position. Now we're in a secondary or tertiary position. If I look at degrees that are conferred in the higher technologies, most of those degrees are not conferred to Americans. And so I think about this geo-competitively, and I say that we are not doing that which we should be doing.
So if we keep going down this road, where do we end up in 10 years?
We'll see that there's an erosion in our competitiveness and our competitive standing. That is geo-competitively. If I look nationally at where we're going, we're creating a permanent underclass. So it used to be the case that education afforded us the opportunity to realize the American dream. Today, it's so stratified that a significant percentage of our population will never realize the American dream because there's an abject failure in those who today have been responsible for investing in education. We spend $35 to $37 billion a year in New York City education. If I look at the latest Nation's report card on the performance of black and brown students in the city, I would say 60 to 70% are below proficient. So I look at that, and the returns, $37 billion, we need new investors. We just have to make certain that people recognize that education is fundamental to the realization of the American dream, the promise of the American dream, the hope. Without education, people have no hope. And we can see that being played out in urban America, can't we? Average age of the trigger puller is somewhere between 12 and 16 years old. So that means the kids who don't have hope, I can't read, I can't write, I can't participate in mainstream society. And therefore my value of life is going to be different, isn't it?
How dangerous is illiteracy in America today?
Illiteracy today reflects the abject failure of those who are leading in the educational world. And so we need to be urgent. Now, the challenge that we have is it doesn't poll. It's not hitting any polls, right? So there are other things here that poll at a much higher rate, at a much higher level, with much higher level of attention than what we see in the world of education. It is fundamental to who we are. And in the Brown versus Board decision, the Supreme Court held that segregated education was inherently unequal. We're now as segregated, if not more segregated, than we were then. So isn't what's at risk here the American dream? A permanent underclass of those who will never realize, never have the promise, the opportunity to realize the American dream? That's why it's imperative that I get new investors.
What about where we're investing in education? Is it more important at this phase to be investing in elementary, middle, high schools rather than higher education?
We need both. We need both. We need to have those people who are the best minds refined so in the world of quantum physics, quantum computing, STEM as you've outlined, that we remain in the lead. So we need to invest there. But remember, as a population between 0 and 3rd grade, we're learning to read. After that, we're reading to learn. And so if we neglect the entry, there's no remediation. Those children will never learn to read.
At the end of the day, this also comes down to jobs and opportunity and the ability to leave the educational system and enter the workforce in a way that can make you successful. What are the things that can be invested in today to help students have that realization at the end?
So we need to access students where they are, right? So I'll give you an example. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, there is a place called Spooky Nook, which is a massive sports complex, and we take our son there, plays basketball. I got 800 kids playing basketball Saturday morning with parents. So if I meet them there, and then somehow begin to integrate education into that experience, now I've got a formula that can begin to meet kids where they are.
Do parents need more support in helping students be successful?
Parents do need more support because what we've created here, the crisis that we've created, has become more intergenerational.
How do you think that building up America's system of colleges works in the future?
We need to invest across the landscape, from the state universities to the private ones, from the Georgia Techs to the Caltechs, from CUNY to CUNY and SUNY to Yale and Harvard. We need to invest, and we need to have the best. Remember, I got to invest in the faculty. I got to invest in the teachers, investing there so that they can invest in the schools. But I need to invest in the principal of the schools and the teachers there so that they don't have to go and use their own hard-earned dollars to buy crayons and toilet paper. Get me there. Get me the fundamentals here.
What keeps you up the most at night about this issue?
Just the negative impact. To the extent that were any one of our children, we would not allow a catastrophe like this to persist for as long as it persisted. We wouldn't allow it to persist one day. Given the polling issue that you're seeing and given the issues around funding, do you worry that the problem gets a lot worse before it ever gets better? I do worry about that. There's a fundamental worry that I have that without addressing it with a level of urgency which is today required, that it worsens. We're already in a catastrophic phase, systemic challenges, and will worsen unless we address it. The consolidation of the issue is that this is the most fundamental right that we have as a country, which is to educate our population.
Sounds like something we've taken for granted.
We have taken it for granted, which is a great way to think about it. Unfortunately, we can no longer take it for granted.
Coming up, Katie Koch, the CEO of TCW Group. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
In a very, very short period of time. Every single child, every single student, everywhere on this planet will actually have access to a tutor, someone who can help educate them one-to-one.
In their pockets.
Right, and we know that one-to-one education is, in fact, the one that has the best value and the best outcome. So the idea that you can have custom to who you are, to your language, you know, male, female, young, old, relatable, you know, funny, serious, Shakespeare, whoever you want, can be your tutor, your teacher that you can learn from, just seems to me like such a amazing transformation across the globe.
Welcome back to the next big risk. TCW's CEO Katie Koch worries that there's a silver tsunami on the horizon with an American population that will live longer. It's something that the retirement plans are not prepared for, as the risk of saving for the future moves from the hands of the government to individual savers.
People are living substantially longer today. Specifically, we now have a lifespan that's 20 years longer today than it was in 1960. As of 2020, for the first time, we had more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 5. And this is going to continue if we look out over the next decade. Two interesting things are that 100% of baby boomers will be 65 and over, so of retirement age. And we also have the possibility, because of advances in healthcare, that will add another 6 years of high quality life. So it's really good news for humanity. At the same time, it's creating some kind of interesting disruptions to the investment opportunity set and, of course, challenges to saving for retirement.
When you think about this longevity risk that exists, what are the implications for society as the retirement burden falls more on individuals?
For much of the history of the last 100 years, let's say, the burden of retirement for Americans was really dealt with by the government after the creation of Social Security, and also by corporates through the defined benefit pension plans. The burden of that has now switched to the individual. And if you look at that number today, only 3% of Americans have access to a defined benefit pension plan. 60% of Americans that do have access to retirement savings, so it's obviously not even all Americans, but the ones that do, it's in a defined contribution plan, which means that the risk has shifted, again, from government and corporates to the individual. And then at the very moment when that burden has transferred to individuals, we have already seen, and we think we're going to continue to see, a migration of some of the most attractive income-producing assets from public to private markets.
What does this mean for the ability of the average American to access income-producing assets? Is it almost impossible these days?
I think there are a lot of solutions to these challenges around retirement, just to tick through them. First, people could, in fact, work longer. The second is that we have to reimagine defined contribution plans for those participants. The third challenge and kind of solution around it is that we do have to hunt more for these income-producing assets. And we need to incorporate some of the things that have gone to private markets into retirement portfolios for clients. As you know, I worked for a very long time in public equity markets, and those markets over the last 20 years were massively disrupted by private markets. And I think we are at the very early stages of fixed income being disrupted and a movement of these income-producing assets from public to private markets. We've seen that in the rise of private credit, pre-global financial crisis. That asset class basically, didn't exist, and now it's well over $1 trillion. And that is taking share from the BSL or bank syndicated loan market. And then there's the securitized market, asset-based finance. And so we have in many of our portfolios, us as well as our peers, do have the ability to invest in some of these illiquid assets. And we need to do some of that where we can on behalf of our clients. And then I would argue that we are going to have to create more product for the defined contribution space that can give dedicated exposure to some of these less liquid assets that may have higher income production than what's available in public markets.
So, when we think about people living longer, what are the forces that are driving longevity at this point?
The main reason that people are living longer is kind of found at the intersection of healthcare and technology. It is going to create innovations that are going to drive this persistent increase in longevity. And with that, that's obviously bringing tremendous investment opportunities for our clients.
There are questions of whether the existing opportunity sets are enough to help people invest through a longer lifespan. How do you rethink how you put money to work?
Healthcare is obviously one that we've already talked a lot about. One less obvious one is how we're thinking about navigating the real estate landscape. We are very positive on residential real estate. We have an elevated rate environment, which is keeping people in their homes. But longevity is also a key tenet of this investment thesis for us. And the reason for that is that the older population is staying in their homes longer. In fact, home ownership rates for people 65 and over are 80%. We've been quite public in our concerns about one of the largest components of commercial real estate, which is office. There are other parts of commercial real estate that are of interest to us. And again, one of them comes back to longevity, which is around senior living. So there is a silver lining here, pun intended, in leaning into aspects of senior living in commercial real estate. That would include independent senior living, assisted senior living, memory care facilities, lab space, hospitals, all of the things that are going to require new square footage to be put in to address this longevity trend.
Do you consider that America risks Japanification, that there are some structural issues here that could really inhibit growth of the country if we don't get this longevity issue and long-term investment issue solved?
I do want to say that demographics are an incredibly important thing for us to think about as investors. Demographics are destiny in some ways. They are the most important driver of what growth trajectory looks like. And clearly in Japan, it's been a very large headwind to growth. I do think the aging population in the U.S. clearly presents a headwind to growth. It is, however, offset by the fact that we have a more friendly immigration policy, which should actually be more of a tailwind to growth. I will say that we do think about it in the context of rates as well. I am, however, continue to be very optimistic about the growth trajectory of the U.S. Because we do have this offset with immigration and also because it's a very innovative country that should drive productivity and growth, as captured, by the way, in all of the healthcare advances that we've made that have created this longevity problem, but also opportunity in the first place.
Coming up, Wes Edens, the co-founder of Fortress Investment Group.
This is Bloomberg.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
the transactions,
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
and the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays.
I think this will probably go down in history as one of, if not the largest financial crimes ever.
I cannot imagine a scenario where $8 billion just disappears.
Bankman-Fried has pled not guilty to multiple fraud charges.
Sam was just too important in the crypto community.
When someone says, I'm going to give $1 billion in the next 2 years, like that catches everybody's attention.
As time went on, their ideas got like weirder and weirder.
I don't think he even had almost a conception at some points that it was wrong or right. I think he just had the mentality that he has to win.
This committee will not stop until we uncover the full truth behind the collapse of FTX.
Sue, Mark.
Are you in? I'm in.
I'm in. We're in.
Will this be the last of its kind? No. This is the nature of capitalism. Get over it.
Welcome back to The Next Big Risk. I'm Shonali Bassick. When Wes Edens isn't busy co-owning NBA and Premier League teams, he's the co-CEO of energy firm New Fortress Energy. Wes is also known for co-founding private investment giant Fortress. And with capital deployed all over the world, Wes is concerned markets aren't pricing in the right risk premium for geopolitical risks.
So I'd say the risk that is something I think about all the time because it's in our life every day is really the geopolitical risk, the rise of that risk as over the last several years, and what the real risks would be kind of broadly should there be any real conflation of that.
When you think about this risk, is it mostly as a citizen or is it as an investor?
You look, 50% of the world's population is going to elect a new leader next year, so it's a particularly charged time for that. There's been so much growth economically in the last 20 to 30 years with globalization, and I feel like we're in the big deglobalization trade. People want to move, semiconductors back on shore, manufacturing back on shore, and all that kind of thing. And then, these regional conflicts that everyone seems to think are going to be contained, whether it's, Israel, Hamas, or, China and Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, I think are not really pricing the possibility, not the probability, but the possibility that something greater could happen. So it's a perilous time, I think, for both economies as well as individuals.
You think about this as an investor. You mentioned you don't think people are pricing in the issue. So how do you start to?
The simple way of thinking about it, of course, is that globalization was the source of a lot of growth without inflation. Deglobalization is kind of the opposite. And so, of course, what that could mean is just higher inflation, higher costs, higher interest rates, a lot of different things.
What would cause inflation to spike? Are there inflationary forces that investors are miscounting?
The U.S. is, current deficit, $34 trillion. It took us 200 years to get to the first trillion, and we've managed to add that up 34 on top of it. So, what that means in terms of people and consumers is that there's competition then for borrowing and for capital. And if the governments are going to be your biggest competitor, it's likely you're going to have much higher rates for a much longer period of time in the long term, perhaps after the short, reset. And I think that, the risk of higher interest rates is one that people don't think about, as much as they should.
Is that directly related to the geopolitical risk out there?
Well, I think geopolitical risk can actually add to that, right? So I think that, again, instability in the world is likely to have significant swings in this. And so, the interest rate component, when I started working on Wall Street many years ago, current coupons were 12, 13, 14, 15%. So much higher rate profile than what we have today. And I think people have become used to these much lower rates. And the question I would ask to people as investors is, what happens in a world where rates are actually much higher for a longer period of time? I think that can be very destabilizing.
There are a lot of concerns that a lot of this decoupling of countries, a lot of the conflict that we're seeing in different regions could lead to a spike in energy prices. How concerned are you, and how much do you think energy pricing can change in the next couple of years because of it? Well,
you're going through a period right now where, oil prices are falling and there seems to be an abundance of oil. But whenever I ask the question, we have to discuss the topic of energy transition, my perspective is although it's great to have, all the renewable, policies, and it's something we are ourselves, very involved in and adamant supporters of, it's going to take a long time before there's true defossilization of these. And so I think we should all be prepared to be using oil and gas in our daily life for a long time. And when you have a significant part of your cost structure that can move up and down in price significantly, that adds a lot to the volatility of the framework of your business.
You worry about the pricing, but what about just the economic security, the energy security involved when you think about these escalating conflicts?
Well, it's a really good question. When you look at what happened with the Russia invasion in Ukraine, and they shut off the gas to Western Europe, that all of a sudden energy security, which wasn't on everyone's lips, became the thing to do. And they responded quickly by building, terminals to bring in gas. It looks like they've done a good job of managing it. But energy security was not a topic that was on the top of people's minds. That, again, gets right at this kind of deglobalization trade. There's just a lot of uncertainty about how the countries are going to work with each other, and that results in just a higher uncertainty coefficient that you have to get paid for it to be a fair investment.
You had mentioned you don't think that a lot of investors are pricing in a lot of the risk premium required for the geopolitical risks that we're facing. How is it possible that so many investors are discounting it at a time where we've seen major wars break out in the last 4 or 5 years?
They haven't really manifested themselves broadly in a way that has impacted a lot of people. I think if you were affected directly, you did pay a lot of attention to it. If you didn't, you were able to kind of ignore it, and it kind of moderated itself and kind of went away. And that's really my point. I think that there are a number of these significant geopolitical circumstances that exist. For the most part, we're all kind of counting that they're not going to turn into something broader, which of course is what we hope, but it's not a sure thing.
Is there a worst case scenario that you plan for, and what does planning for it look like?
Worst case, what we do take a very hard look at is like, where do you want to have your capital exposed? I think where it probably manifests itself with us is on the leverage side. We want to be as unleveraged as possible, and we're in businesses that generate a lot of cash flow, and so you're going to end up reinvesting that in your balance sheet to kind of bring down leverage, in a fairly significant way. I think businesses that rely on a lot of leverage and will rely on it going forward, they just have a lot more exposure to it.
In my mind, I think also, how do you calculate? How do you calculate the risk premium embedded in this question?
Am I more worried about investment or civil unrest? I do think what you're seeing right now in immigration is a real challenge in this country. I mean, this is a nation that's built on immigration, so that's kind of the heart and center of the U.S. This illegal immigration stuff to me seems worrying because A, we need a lot of immigration here because demographics is destiny as you do it, but B, it seems like it should be a lot more lawful. And I think that's the kind of thing that really kind of gets people very exercised.
Do you think this idea of deglobalization adds to this issue, this more nationalistic policy that you're seeing in many countries?
I think that's a great way of putting it because it creates this us versus them as opposed to we and us.
Do you think that deglobalization is bad for the economy writ large?
For sure. I mean, I think that perhaps it went too far the other way, where we basically didn't price out any risk of decentralizing all that we actually manufactured. And then you came with these big supply chain problems during the pandemic, and it became very evident that maybe that wasn't a perfect idea. I think the pendulum could easily swing too far the other way. And if it does so, then you're not taking the benefit of low-cost labor or low-cost materials or other things around the globe. So these things are very, very hard to moderate those cycles. We have a challenging enough time in this country managing our own economy. We try and do that, writ large across a lot of different economies. I think it's actually a very, very difficult thing to manage.
That's it for this episode of The Next Big Risk. You can watch previous interviews on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Shonali Basak, and this is Bloomberg.
Top names in climate finance are on Bloomberg.
I can't tell whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about climate finance.
A lot of great stuff is happening, but is it enough? No, it's not enough.
I'm biased. I'm a huge investor in both fission and fusion and hoping that it comes in time.
Transition is not going to be an event. It's a process.
But at the end of the day, it's the right thing for the planet, it's the right thing for the industry, and there is business opportunity.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, that we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, wow, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, hosts Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters. Get the latest from and about politics' biggest power players at the end of every trading day. Balance of Power, live around the world every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. Income Fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield at its new time Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome to the Best of the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit 2023. I'm Francie Lacroix. Founded by His Royal Highness Prince William, the Earthshot Prize aims to repair and regenerate the planet by helping to discover and scale solutions to climate change. This year's summit brought together policymakers, global business leaders, and climate activists to put a spotlight on the solutions that could help address the world's biggest environmental challenges. Bloomberg's Emily Chang spoke with Bill Gates on what some of those solutions look like.
Bill, you recently wrote a book about how we can avoid climate, quote unquote, disaster. And yet we've seen record heat all summer, as I'm sure everybody here in New York knows. Give us your assessment of where we are now. Are we still on the verge of disaster, or is the world getting the message?
Well, we've certainly made a great deal of progress. You know, if you look at carbon emissions per person in a country like the UK, they're a third of what they were back 30 years ago when it was very coal-driven. You know, there's a lot of efficiency sectors, and so it's pretty clear, you know, we're not going to go to the extreme scenarios because emissions will peak and then start to go down. They won't go down as fast as we want them to, and so the temperature will continue to rise. And once the temperature's risen, it doesn't go down very quickly. Unless you do massive carbon removal, you basically are at that equilibrium temperature and you have to do the adaptation. So people should feel good, particularly about the upstream innovation. It's very exciting across every area of emission that since 2015, when the innovation agenda got supercharged, we've seen fantastic progress. And now we need to roll that out in a very fast process, which the scale of it's bigger than anything humanity's ever done.
Well, and I wonder if we should feel good about the level of investing, because obviously you have invested personally billions and through your organization, Breakthrough Energy, but also climate tech has hit record levels. Climate tech investing has hit record levels recently. Is it enough?
Well, we can always use more upstream investment, but certainly in the financial environment we were in until a year ago, the rise from 2015, you know, where it was somewhat out of fashion because there had been a lot of losses, the rise until a year ago was pretty gigantic. And, you know, Breakthrough Energy has 100 companies. There's several hundred other really good companies. And so I didn't expect in some of the toughest areas like steel and cement and agriculture to see there are solutions that will, once their technology is rolled out, scaled up, and matures, get to this magic green premium of zero, where you can go to the middle-income countries that are 60% of emissions and say to them, hey, you have to make steel a new way, but that steel will not be more expensive. Likewise for cement or beef or dairy. In 2015, when this got kicked off in Paris, we didn't know how successful the innovation would be. And it's been far more successful than I expected. So, we need to fund these projects. We need to get them scaled up. But, innovation is delivering very well.
So one of the organization's breakthrough backs is, of course, 4401, not 4401. It's 4401, according to the scientists. Talk to us, Talal, about your carbon removal solution, because this is a massively hard problem, and especially storage is a really hard problem. What makes your technology different?
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. So we eliminate CO2, that's what we do, and we do that by a process called mineralization. So we have a rock on this planet called peridotite, typically found 40 kilometers in the subsurface. However, it's been pushed up to the surface in certain places around the world. And peridotite's quite special because it's really reactive with carbon dioxide. So when it comes in contact with CO2, it actually mineralizes it. And you can see these white veins over here in the rock. Just pass it over to you if you want to have a closer look. So this is a natural process. And what we are doing with our technology is we are speeding up this natural process by about 100,000 times. So rather than it taking decades in nature, we're speeding it up to months. Now, because we're converting it into a rock, this is considered the gold standard of carbon storage. So it means that you don't need to monitor, you don't need to insure it, and it gives carbon credit buyers certainty that the CO2 is converted into rock. They never have to worry about it again.
So it's there forever.
It is there forever.
So we replace the toxic chemicals that go into battery production with simple water and water-soluble materials. So this lowers the energy usage by around 30%. Luckily, it lowers the cost as well, but really importantly, it makes it more recyclable. Because it's water-made, we can dissolve the important materials off the electrode simply in water at end of life, and for our own scrap.
10 years down the line, this is the decade of change we've talked about. And 10 years down the line, when we look back, I want to make sure that we've found the right solutions, we've found the right people, but we're also maximizing their impact. And I think, I'm already starting to think about after 10 years, what happens? And many people are already asking me that question. And I'll need a few brains in this room to help me work out what we do next. But it's, I'm really pleased with the team and how we've achieved the first 3 years. It's gone better than I hoped, but there's still a lot of work to do.
We've seen today that the Earthshot Prize finalists are coming from all over the world. We've seen today from Australia, India, Oman, and Kenya. So this is a truly worldwide cohort that you're bringing together. So in your own words, why do you believe that global collaboration is important to reach your mission?
So I'm a big believer in a big team. I don't think any solutions in the world can ever be achieved by yourself. And one of my roles has always been to build coalitions, to build relationships, build teams, and this is no different. I'm building an enormous team of brilliant people and letting them crack on and do the work that needs to be done. So I think that's really important to kind of have the dynamism, the innovation, and the drive that you all have, and you've demonstrated in your ways. And all we're doing is providing you with a leg up to become a household name and to have the visibility to the right people. But as an example, I think for everyone here, one of the things that comes out of this is that on a collaboration level that wasn't intended but is happening is Costa Rica won in 2021. They completely off their own backs because they take this very seriously and they take pride in the environment. They reached out to another finalist called Restore, which is effectively a data company that monitors carbon sinks amongst other things. And together, they're monitoring 5,000 reforestation projects in Costa Rica. So it's the first public, effectively independent public verifier of national policy on forestation. And they'll hold them to that account, they'll have the data, and they'll drive that forwards. And so these collaborations are happening without us even trying. And that's the kind of thing over the next few years, we want to see more and more of that going. But again, these things only can happen with the support of the wider society around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you know about this, but we are talking about an Earthshot village, right, where we can bring all of our solutions together. So I think it's all coming together. I think it's time for the scaling question because we won't reach all of our targets and actually realize this ambition that we have if we don't have exponential growth and if we don't actually get these solutions to scale. And so we've heard this topic quite mentioned oftentimes today, and even by yourself. So I'm wondering, how can people here today get behind these solutions, and what does scaling these products and solutions, for example, like Takachar, one of the winners from 2021, what does that mean to scale those solutions?
So Takachar, for anyone who doesn't know, is they won in 2021, a fantastic Indian designer who created effectively a mobile furnace, if you like, that can be transported around farms in India. He was trying to develop and tackle the smog and the pollution from when they burn the crops in Delhi, and it effectively cuts out 98% of smoke pollution, and the offcuts and the offshoots of or the waste from the farm go into the furnace and are burnt into fertilizer, rather than being burnt into the atmosphere in a fire. So the farmers can then reclaim, reuse, and sell on effectively their fertilizer. He reckons with scale that he can reduce 1 billion tons of CO2. Wow. Get my stats right. So it's really important that we can get these things to scale because they can have huge impact. And we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, the Nopla guys did a brilliant presentation, and we regularly get them to come up and talk about it because they're a good double act. But they also present a wonderful project and a vision for what scaling really looks like. And I think that's what gives us all hope and inspiration and optimism, that you guys have this journey, and we're here to facilitate and promote your journey to achieving greater things.
Coming up, more from the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. This is Bloomberg.
Regional sports networks. There's a lot of, it's a business that seems to be collapsing. Leagues have sort of toyed around with, should we do something ourselves? Some teams are doing like local TV and streaming. How do you see that shaking out?
So I don't think I'm right on this, but my instincts keep telling me this is what's going to happen. Because if you remember the WWE, they launched their own network that had their own content and had their own pay-per-views. And it was kind of a smart, bold, ahead of its time move. And then they pivoted at the perfect time, and they sold their content to, what was it, Peacock.
Yeah.
And that was really smart, too, because they were able to leverage that number as high as possible. So they always zagged where the money was when the opportunity was. I think the opportunity for the NBA with the local teams would be to own all that themselves.
This is Bloomberg News Now.
News when you want it at the touch of a button.
Another volatile day on Wall Street. We're seeing big moves.
All eyes on Capitol Hill as Democrats and Republicans prepare.
Today's job numbers casting doubt on the Fed's next move. Inflation remains front and center. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Get it 24/7 on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Bloomberg News Now. Context changes everything.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
Welcome back to the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. I'm Francine Lacroix. Inspired by President John F. Kennedy's moonshot, the Earthshot Prize supports solutions to the harm brought about by the climate crisis. And like the moonshot, the aim is to do it all within the Earthshot decade. Earthshot trustee and former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern spoke with former winners to see what progress has been made so far.
Now, for many in this room who work in the environment and climate space, they'll understand why it's so important to engage Indigenous groups in the guardianship of oceans. But tell us a little more from your perspective of why that's so important.
I think the one thing that I always tell people is that we are there. I remember sitting in a Queensland Parks meeting and they said, we have this beautiful biodiversity and it's a pretty national park. And I said, yeah, but it's my home. My ancestors were here. My mother's here, and she still works as a ranger. I'm here, and we're going to be here for generations to come. We've been observing our land and sea country for generations. So we need to work together. We need to work with Western science and traditional science to be able to make everything come together with a better picture on how we should be looking after land and sea country.
Brilliant. Now, Kaushik, I'm going to ask you, you have an ambitious goal of reaching 50,000 farmers by 2027 and 1 million farmers in 10 years with your greenhouse in a box. So just a small goal. Now, there are 100 million smallholder farmers in India who are extremely vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Tell us how you remain engaged with the community and why that is so important.
Right. Yeah, I would say that it is a small goal because there are 100 million smallholder farmers in India and 500 million across the world. And they're all struggling with the impacts of climate change, and they see them much ahead of most other communities. So Kheti was started because we spent time with those communities, and we talked to almost 1,000 farmers, over 6 months, lived with them, worked with them, and did farming with them so that we could understand those impacts that they are seeing firsthand. So I think that unless we solve the problem for those 500 million, we are not really going to have a long-term future in terms of food security, livelihood, so many other areas. So coming back to the point of sort of engaging with the community, there's no way we can build solutions without engaging with the community. So I did not come from a farming family. I am from India. I am from the area that we work in, but my context is completely different. So at every step of the way, like I mentioned in the beginning, it was talking to 1,000 farmers before even thinking of greenhouses as a solution, to understand the problem first. Then at every step of the solution, our greenhouse was designed in collaboration with farmers. So in our latest version of the greenhouse, more than 2,000 farmers had inputs where they co-designed the greenhouse with us. And that's the reason it works for them right now. Even now, as we scale up, we work with community-led organizations, women farmer groups, to not only design the program, but think about how do we scale this. Because when you're building a solution for a community, if you are solution first, the solution will fail, it will not scale. But if you are user first, if you're community first, and you involve them in every part of the decision making, that's when we can actually achieve that ambitious goal of not only a million, but the big vision is that every smallholder farmer on this planet has access to climate smart technologies and doesn't worry about the future because of climate change.
For conserving the world's most important places where the coral reefs, mangroves are, seagrass, it's local action that can have the greatest impact. It's the coastal fishers, their communities, and their local leaders like the Coastal 500 that we support as RARE that matters most. And so it's the local action that we think is the greatest impact for the future of these resources for the planet and those communities.
When we won the Earthshot Prize a year ago, we had sold about 250,000 stoves. Last week, this week, yesterday, we reached 400,000 households with our clean cook stoves. But then that's not the only thing that's happened.
Something to clap about. It's a big number.
Thank you. That's not the only thing that's happening. There's this quote that says, if you allow people to have basic essential needs, if you allow people the resources that they need, then they have the opportunity to dream. And for me, you would think that I already had that with Mukuru, but after we won the Earthshot Prize, again, I was able to dream and be creative. And so in December, a few weeks after we won, I was reading a report by the CDC, and it was talking about families still catching malaria even when they have access to mosquito nets. And reading the timelines when they were getting bitten by mosquitoes, it was around the time when they were cooking with our stoves. And so I thought, what can we do? And then again, I learned that Kenya and Tanzania, I'm from Kenya, we're the largest producers of pyrethrin in the world. And pyrethrin is the strongest insecticide in the world. So then I decided I was going to infuse that into our briquette. So when you burn it, it turns your home into a mosquito repellent zone, and it allows for protection for 12 hours. And one of the Earthshot partners just decided to give us some more money. They're funding us to be able to do more research and bring this product to more households.
You're one of, I think, the first restaurants to get certification for cultivated meat. Is this the future?
Well, I've been supporting any company that is trying to bring new solutions in how we're going to be feeding humanity. I am a guy that supports small farmers, small fishermen. I adore to support those people. They are the heart and the DNA of who we are. But I do believe it's the role of everybody to push the boundaries of what is possible, to try to feed humanity in a better way, in a way that we don't use so much water. So supporting cultivated meat in my restaurants is only a way to, not to say, I am not supporting small farmers, but on the contrary, it's a way to say we need to be open-minded. We need to make sure that we find different ways and diversify the food production we have. Planet Earth is only going to get, with more population, before we know, we're going to get to 8-9 billion people. We are going to have to be very creative in how we produce water, in how we maximize the use of the water. At the end, everything is water. So what we need to do, in this case with the cultivated meat, a great way to produce protein that is going to be able to minimize how much water is used to produce that meat.
Coming up, more from the Plaza Hotel and the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. This is Bloomberg.
In a very, very short period of time, every single child, every single student, everywhere on this planet will actually have access to a tutor, someone who can help educate them one-to-one.
In their pockets.
Right, and we know that one-to-one education is, in fact, the one that has the best value and the best outcome. So the idea that you can have custom to who you are, to your language, you know, male, female, young, old, relatable, you know, funny, serious, Shakespeare, whoever you want, can be your tutor, your teacher that you can learn from, just seems to me like such a amazing transformation across the globe.
What happened was you were offered a money-losing women's basketball team, and you said, I want to be in the other sports as well. Is that right?
Well, yeah, you know, you got to be smart about this.
Welcome back to the Best of the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit 2023. I'm Francine Lacqua. The summit marked both Climate Week in New York and the United Nations General Assembly, highlighting the global need for climate solutions. The 15 finalists competing for this year's Earthshot Prize came from all over the world with the aim of scaling local solutions to fix global problems. Take a look.
In 5 years, we are hoping to actually be in 250 marine areas. Right now, we're supporting 96 in 16 countries. These are coral reefs that are most likely to survive through climate change impacts. These are mangroves and seagrass meadows that are sucking carbon out of the air and locking it away for millennia. These are places with coastal fisheries, with hundreds of coastal fisher livelihoods. They're sharks, sea turtles, etc.
When we say the sea and the maritime routes are essential
our lifeblood, it's not just a talking point. It's the real thing. The survival and the prosperity of people on islands all over the world are dependent on the vitality of the sea and how we live and make a living. And it applies to us because even for those of us who are in the sea, we could also be sea-locked if we don't have access to the sea routes from which our trade and our prosperity and peace depends on. The ocean provides food, jobs, livelihood, and as I said just now, for the global trade. And the big concern now is the impact of climate change.
And if you think on a coconut, how a coconut transport water is amazing, right? It's not only water, it's coconut water, it's delicious. It doesn't generate waste, and the most beautiful part of it is that if you throw it away, the coconut, a new coconut tree will grow. Imagine if you could do that with a plastic bottle. If you throw a plastic bottle and a plastic bottle tree will grow. That's, we didn't want the airshot because of that, but maybe, you know, but we created this. We call it O because was the name that people give it when they see it for the first time. They make that sound, like oh. And basically it's a membrane made out of seaweed that can contain water or any type of liquids. Pierre holds oranges, right?
It's literally edible, so it's packaging you can eat. Cheers.
It's a membrane because nature uses membranes to contain any type of liquids. It's the most efficient way. And it's not a technology that we invented. It's a technology that had been there for many years in the 1930s to make things like fake caviar. And we just use it to make packaging. We scale it up, and it's made out of seaweed.
And we discovered along this journey how amazing seaweed is. First of all, seaweed grows without requiring any fresh water, any fertilizers. So compared to agriculture, humans can't really mess around with this system. It just grows on its own. And incredibly, like when it grows, it actually kind of like revives the oceans. It's really great for bringing fish. It can be farmed with aquaculture very easily, providing livelihood for people on the coastline. And importantly, like it's so abundant. Some of the seaweed that we use grow up to 1 meter per day. So it's the fastest growing organism on this planet. And what's amazing is that seaweed has been around for about 1 billion years. So nature really knows what to do at end of life. So it means that if it ends up in nature, and inevitably a lot of our waste does, it never creates a long-lasting waste. So it really never creates the chance for plastic to create all of these problems.
In the 3 short years since its founding, the Earthshot Prize finalists and winners have taken great leaps with their solutions, and they're already delivering on their potential, and I'm so proud. At latest count, the 2021 cohort have protected or restored 2 million hectares of ocean, reduced, avoided, or sequestered 3,000 tons of CO2, the equivalent of burning 39 million pounds of coal, protected or restored 7,000 hectares of land, the equivalent of 20 central parks, and removed, upcycled, or avoided over 40,000 tons of waste. If you're counting, that's the equivalent of 195 Statue of Liberties. And something that I'm especially proud of is how many of the finalists and winners are from Africa, home of the world's most acute sustainable development challenges, but also the biggest sustainable development opportunities.
And that's all from the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. You can find the full panel discussions and more on the Bloomberg Terminal and Bloomberg.com. I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is Bloomberg.
Liquidity is the lifeblood of an airline. We make very conservative decision-making about when we raise funding and how we raise funding. We try to diversify our sources, and we're always very focused on the actual rates. And we like to build in flexibility in these financing structures so that we have an opportunity to prepay debt when appropriate so that we can continue to optimize the overarching rates that we're paying.
What have you learned with the dynamic move of the interest rates
that we've seen from Chairman Powell. I mean, do you go fixed structure or floating structure, much more like what they do in Europe?
Yes and yes. We have a mix currently. It's a little bit of a different model than what I was used to in the public company space. Say in some ways we provide ourselves with a natural hedge, leaving some of our debt floating and some fixed.
You have to have the short-term discipline to sort of circle the wagons around cash. I mean, cash is oxygen. I know where every ounce of cash is going, but we also have to be nimble around that as well because things change by the day. I know the folks who aren't willing to invest right now may have large pockets of investment in the future. So I want to be in front of them. They may not be a buyer at this point, but I do want to spend a lot of time in front of that other set that is a buyer at this point. They're interested. They want to be an early adopter of the stock. They're interested in the story.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
You can see the massive gains for the OG crypto coin.
The breakout we have all perhaps long awaited finally realized. We'll see if it sticks.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
There's no question this industry is composed of some bad actors and some good actors.
The transactions.
Volumes have surpassed $24 billion per day.
And the technology.
Stop talking about the technology, start demonstrating the utility.
Bloomberg Crypto. Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern every weekday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Today, we are in conversation with the authors of Permacrisis, a plan to fix a fractured world. Joining us is Gordon Brown. He is currently the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education. He was Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer for more than a decade before becoming Prime Minister. Michael Spence is currently a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his contributions to the analysis of markets with asymmetric information. And renowned economist, a good friend of ours, Mohammed Al-Arian, currently President of Queen's College, Cambridge, and is also the Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz, the corporate parent of PIMCO, where he served as CEO. Gents, good to see all three of you. I've said this a few times already. It speaks to the modesty of the three of you that the first line of the first page reads, "This book is not meant to be a substitute for melatonin." I can tell all three of you it wasn't. I've read this one as fast as I can. Let's start with the title. Gordon, what's in a name? What is the permacrisis?
I think it's a cascade of crises. You've got pandemics, of course, climate, you've got recession, you've got wars, and you've also got the state of British politics, the state of American politics, the state of European politics, and a general malaise amongst the international institutions. And what I think is unique is we used to talk about shared problems and then common problems. We're now talking about global problems. So climate, infectious diseases, financial stability, none of these things can be resolved without globally coordinated action. They can't be solved by one country on their own. They can't be solved by a group of countries. You've got to find a way of the world working together. So we emphasize the importance of cooperation and how it can be brought about.
Mike, there's a feeling that that's not happening. And it's odd to many that our interconnectedness over the last few decades has increased, but cooperation seems to be declining. Why is that the case?
There are a lot of different causes, Jonathan, but, you know, the rise of China, the rise of this sort of threatening strategic competition between the two is part of it. Part of it was that the globalization patterns that ran for several decades produced some, or contributed to some unequal outcomes in terms of economics, so that's now reflected in politics, and causes an increase in nationalism, an increase in populism, a kind of negative attitude toward globalization in its previous form. So I think what Gordon's talking about, we're all talking about, is trying to reinvent a fit-for-purpose version of globalization that is respectful of the realities and practicalities of strategic competition, national security, and other things.
One thing you engage with in the book and try to navigate is the crisis into the next crisis into the next crisis. Mohammed, something that's popped up in conversations we've had over the years is whether this is just a sequence of unfortunate events, whether these are self-inflicted wounds, or if there is something structural about the changes we're witnessing at the moment.
So we argue in the book it's all three. There certainly has been bad luck. But beyond that, there is something structural, which is the inability to grow and grow in an inclusive manner and one that respects our planet. And then we have shot ourselves in the foot several times with policy mistakes. So if you look at the three contributing factors, going from globalization to fragmentation and lack of cooperation, repeated policy mistakes, and the lack of growth, then you get the sense of going from one crisis to another. And what united us was worries about the world we were going to leave our kids. And what made us write this book in an urgent fashion is the realization that the longer this world continues, the harder it gets to solve it.
You think the stakes are that high?
I think the stakes are very, very high.
So what we need is three things. We need a new theory of growth that takes into account environmental needs, equity, good jobs. We need a new theory of economic management that balances fiscal and monetary considerations, but also is aware of the problems related to financial instability. And we need a new theory of international cooperation. We need to find a way where countries which don't share the same ideologies, don't necessarily share the same narrow interests, can find a way of working together even when it's difficult. Otherwise, you cannot solve the problem of climate change. You cannot deal with infectious diseases. You cannot do, as we tried to do in 2009, bring people together to deal with a financial problem that was global and not simply American or Western or Chinese. You have to find a way of doing these things if the world is going to work better.
I wanted to pick up on China. There's a stat in the book that jumped off the page for me. Mike, back in 1990, China's share of global manufacturing was 3.5%. 20 years, 30 years later, 2021, it's 30.5%. Is it any wonder that electorates in the West have become disillusioned with liberalism and globalization?
No, the globalization was, and my profession is partly complicit in this, was conducted with relatively little attention to its distributional effects. And I think one of the messages of this book that we tried to convey is that's not a good idea in the past, but going forward. So if we try to tackle climate change without paying attention to the distributional impacts of the various strategies for going forward, there'll be resistance and it will ultimately fail. So, but yeah, China became the dominant manufacturer in the world over an astonishingly short period of time.
There is an underlying optimism in the book. And as I'm reading it, Gordon, I'm wondering if others reading it will share that underlying optimism. Is nationalism just too tempting now?
It's dangerous. I mean, if people see life in terms of a struggle between the us, the insiders, and the them, the outsiders, you cannot make progress. There's no chance of a great deal of international cooperation if people are protectionist, if they're xenophobic, if they're isolationist, if they're mercantilist. But I think when we take Mike's point, globalization was open, but it wasn't inclusive. If we can have a managed globalization that is inclusive, that shows it can deal with environmental issues, can have a sense of what good jobs are about and a sense of equity, then I think we can move forward. And the interesting thing is, if you listen to Chinese, American, Western leaders, they all, in a sense, want the same thing. They want a globalization that works for the citizens. They want one that produces prosperity and therefore growth. So there's no point in being anti-growth. It's the way to actually get standards of living up. But they also want it to be inclusive. Now, there must be sufficient common ground for people to be able to work together on some solutions. And I can look at sort of issues, famine in Africa. You can look at climate change, droughts, and all the sort of difficulties we experience with floods and climate change. And you can think, yes, most countries around the world share the same aspiration to do something about these things. We've got to find a way of coming together.
Will AI do to services what globalization has done to manufacturing?
Yes. I mean, I think the straight answer is yes.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
DOJ or other authorities
could face bigger challenges next.
It was going to keep reading World Cup. This is a 3
as the economic picture.
covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
If you think about events of the last 18 months, Mohammed, to some extent, the issues with Russia, the war that they've started, proves that trade does not prevent war. And if anything, at this point, there might be an argument to be made that national security now trumps comparative advantage. How do you convince countries to cooperate with each other when it's unclear what the benefits will be?
So first, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have this image of who's driving the car. For decades, it was the economy. And national security and domestic politics were passengers, were co-pilots, but they didn't have the wheel. Today, it's very different. It's national security and domestic politics that's holding the wheel, and economics is in the back seat, if not even further out from there. So yes, we've got to recognize that there's been a change in the ranking of priorities. However, these are not mutually exclusive. And what we point out in the book is that in order to have strong national security, in order for your domestic politics to work well, you've got to get your growth correct. It's got to be more inclusive. It's got to be more respectful of the planet. You've got to stop making policy mistakes. And you've got to have more global cooperation. Otherwise, it's not that they compete with each other. All three will not be met.
Mike, we talked about what had happened with manufacturing over the last 3 decades or so. Let me ask you this. And I know you explore this to some degree. Will AI do to services what globalization has done to manufacturing?
Yes. I mean, I think there is, the straight answer is yes, there is the potential there. I was pretty sure that digital, including the breakthroughs through last year, I guess, in AI were a basis for producing a productivity surge that relieved very substantial supply-side constraints that were driving all kinds of things that are dysfunctional, including inflation and other things. It was a different world than the one we lived in. But when Gen AI came along, and I saw its sort of multi-domain capability, the fact that you can use it with no technical training, just a little bit of practice, creating prompts, and its applicability pretty much everywhere, I thought, even though it's early days, and we're in a period of exploration and experimentation, I think it's a reasonable forecast that this tool is an important part of a future productivity surge. And if it comes, it'll make it a lot easier to do inclusive growth patterns because it won't be a zero-sum game. It'll be easier to invest multi-trillions of dollars in the energy transition. It's going to be terribly difficult to get that done with fiscal space declining, the rising debt levels, and rising interest rates. So that's why we spend a fair amount of time. It's not that the growth by itself is the only thing. It's that it enables an awful lot of what we want to accomplish.
Yeah, I think we're heading for a low-growth decade if we don't have the productivity surge that AI can give us. And I think what Mike is pointing out is it can transform a whole range of industries. You'll never see the accountancy or legal or even medical professions or teaching profession be the same again if AI has the impact that I think and Mike thinks it will have. But equally, we've got to have that productivity surge, because without that, the inflation, the fiscal space being narrowed, the debt that we're running, and of course the supply side shocks and constraints that are in existence mean that as things stand, we're heading for a low-growth decade. AI is the way forward to take us out of growth, and I think Mohammed agrees with that.
No, totally. And it's critical because we have a debt issue. that has to be resolved. We have an inequality issue. We need resources for critical transitions. So, you know, the notion, as Mike and Gordon correctly said, that higher, more inclusive growth and more sustainable growth is a massive enabler to deal with all these other problems.
All three of you understand the risks involved, though. If globalization hollowed out manufacturing bases domestically in places like America, in the United Kingdom to some extent as well, and I'm asking the question, why wouldn't AI do the same thing to services? My question, if I'm a member, a citizen, someone who's got to vote, is why would I trust the same people all over again? Who should I trust to manage that transition, that integration of those technologies?
That's what my children say. My young teenagers say, you guys have messed it up. And it is true that we tried to create a more inclusive system. We tried to deal with the problems of the environment, but we couldn't get the agreement that we needed. And we tried to have more equity and better jobs. But I do think when I talk to young people, they want to see this change. You know, the issue is not whether you have change or not now. The issue is what kind of change, and we've got to make that change inclusive.
Mike?
Agree. I mean, you know, Eric Brynjolfsson talked about the Turing trap. You know, the Turing test basically pushes you in the direction of automation. We want to push, in policy, should be pushing in the direction of augmentation, of giving people powerful tools that make them more productive. So this is the journey we're setting on, but it's not, I don't think, right to just capitulate and say productivity produces employment problems. It's at least more complicated than that, Jonathan.
But our global institutions have got to reform to be capable of dealing with this. They're not fit for purpose at the moment. And the IMF has got to be a crisis prevention mechanism to do proper surveillance of the world economy. It can't just be there for crisis resolution. The World Bank has got to become a global public goods bank and deal with the energy transition as well as human capital. The World Trade Organization has got to find a way of diplomacy and negotiation and arbitration working better than it has in the past. And we need a better concept of burden sharing. I mean, I cannot understand why, when you have a humanitarian crisis, and we have many around the world at the moment, all we seem to be able to do is pass the begging bowl round and hope that someone's going to produce some money. We've got to have a system of burden sharing, whether it's for the environment, or whether it's for public health, or whether it's for some of the other global public goods we want to do now. If you talk to people around the world, I've just come back from the United Nations, they all want this to happen.
Mike often says there is no new China. There is no new Eastern Europe coming on to the global market. Things are fundamentally changed.
I think this will probably go down in history as one of, if not the largest financial crimes ever.
I cannot imagine a scenario where $8 billion just disappears.
Bankman-Fried has pled not guilty to multiple fraud charges.
Sam was just too important in the crypto community.
When someone says, I'm going to give $1 billion in the next 2 years, like that catches everybody's attention.
As time went on, their ideas got like weirder and weirder.
I don't think he even had almost a conception at some points that it was wrong or right. I think he just had the mentality that he has to win.
This committee will not stop until we uncover the full truth behind the collapse of FTX.
Sue, Mark.
Are you in? I'm in.
I'm in.
We're in.
Will this be the last of its kind? No. This is the nature of capitalism. Get over it.
You've written about this extensively over the last 18 months. I still remember a conference we did together in the summer of 2021 when you warned about what could possibly be coming and how ill-prepared the institution that is the Federal Reserve was for this moment. How do they recover from the mistakes they've made in the last 18 months? to help contribute to the vision the three of you have?
So the recovery is starting. I think there's much broader recognition now that there's been 5 failures. Analysis, transitory inflation, forecasts, consistently too optimistic, action, too late, communication, muddled, and regulation.